And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, pretty crazy week.
It is indeed.
I have to say, really off the charts. And today, of course, with all the Supreme Court action and all the rest, but Lord knows we're not going to get into that tonight.
No.
But it's going to be interesting to watch. The fissures and the different sides of all these things rolling out. But tonight we have something very special for you on the 75th anniversary of Kenneth Arnold, the Idaho pilot, who was traveling near Mount Rainier in Washington State and had the first wave of sightings of 9 different UFOs. And that's what started the whole UFO craze, as it were, June 24th. 1947. Here we are, and the question is, where are we now on all this? 75 years later, intense obfuscation, intense grabbing of data and technology by very, very deep groups I refer to as X-Protect on this program, and the Central Intelligence Agency's assassination, flight madness, and so on, and a huge wave of deep state control as a result. And now, finally, the breakaways trying to break back in, as it were, and roll out this phony UFO threat aspect, but coupled around the great development of the continuity of government program for 75 years, as well as the Central Intelligence Agency, the anniversary of the National Security Act coming up here very shortly in 2022. Also, I'm actually stunned at all of the kind of amazing anniversaries that we're having this year. Let's start with this. Watergate was last week. We had Millie Weaver on. That's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's very interesting because the arc of Watergate carries over to this exact same story as well. So we're looking at the same players in some cases, but definitely the same mechanism, which is continuity of government. This program, over and over again, when we get into the deep events that have been controlling public policy for decades, we again find ourselves in the middle of that sway of continuity of government through the figure of John Dean, the president's lawyer, who had just, before taking the assignment with Nixon, been working for continuity of government. James McCord, one of the Watergate burglars, supposedly going in under orders from Nixon, although that was never quite established. And that what they ended up getting Nixon for was the cover-up, not ordering the break-in. But it is interesting to look at McCord because he also worked for continuity of government. So we have these people around the Doomsday Network showing up over and over again through history, in the Star Wars program, in Iran-Contra, in September 11th attacks, and even in the crash of 2008. And if we go deep, we're going to find all kinds of continuity of action right there in the COVID op as well. So we seem to be dealing with this over and over again, whether we want to or not. So it's high time to get fully acquainted with it, and that's what we're going to do tonight. This is X Series 128. We're looking at 75 years of the National Security Act, the decimation of the rule of law in America through the Central Intelligence Agency, continuity of government, and the secrecy, the wall of secrecy that has arisen since. And when we get into those details, we can unpack some of those layers and unwind some of that disinformation program that has wound down now over 75 years and seems to be ramping up worse than ever. So we're going to be getting into that tonight. A quick reminder to everyone that we're going to be taking your questions, and Miss Olivia will be putting those together now. And before we go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
It's great. It's actually quite warm. I'm surprised that everybody is just sort of
in such a good
having
mood.
they're having a love fest in the ideas room. I did want to throw this out to you. Jay Vanderbest said, I didn't realize it, but today is 6/24/2022, which equals 666.
Well, there's an incredible astrological alignment of the moon with 5 planets today, which kind of rides that, grand alignment there in astrology. And from what I understand, it's a positive alignment. But whenever you get around 666, it's a deep, deep problem from the esoteric level. Of course, it's the mark of the beast in the Revelation, of course. but it also has other ways. And as a matter of fact, in the mystery school tradition, Rudolf Steiner and Edgar Casey referred to 1998 as a very crucial date, which was the 666 times 3 date. And it brought us into a new system where we have to kind of take on these challenges from a different level. And Casey called it a testing period, and Steiner referring to it as this harmonic battle, which comes through the technology. Not if the technology is a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. Technology can be incredibly enriching for humanity, but through the technology, we come face to face with the scientific materialism, which wants to just weigh things. And if it can't be weighed, and if it can't be understood from a scientific perspective, then it doesn't exist. That's the way that they want things to be. This is a very interesting clash, because the march of the world is towards freedom, is towards expansion and spiritual enlightenment. But there's a group, and it goes deeper than just, kind of a regular kind of political group or something of that nature. It is a very deep, esoteric, etheric, physical force. And so it's been described in religious traditions, and they try to go after it in terms of like, these are evil things, or these are demonic, or these are dark spirits, whatever it would happen to be. But when we get to the mystery schools, what they're telling us is that these are impulses that need to be faced, and that they need to be conquered, in fact. And that's no walk in the park. And as we can see in 2022, for sure, we're right in the thick of it. But what's important, I think, about this show and this anniversary, and there's so many anniversaries this year that this is one of a streak of shows that we're going to do. Of course, the 75th anniversary of the Roswell case is coming up. Very important case, and it's going to be featured tonight as well, with the role of Jesse Marcel and the things that he brought forward about the case, and how this represents an interaction of some other level of intelligence with us. And I know there are many shenanigans and theories around Roswell also, but what I would say is that for sure it represents an interaction with a different level of being. And that's why it was instantly covered up. And what's so interesting is by the time we get to the Kenneth Arnold case, because what's happened is, there's a great cover-up around Roswell within a day, that by the time you get to his 1952 book, which is called The Coming of the Saucers, Arnold is left out there describing all this stuff in kind of a void, because the Roswell case won't get reported until 1978. So it's quite interesting, because with that information, with that knowledge, maybe the entire Kenneth Arnold case would have gone on to a different level, because it was such an incredible sighting. And I think it is worthy for us to stop and say 75 years since this case, and where are we with it? One of the things I will say in relation to Arnold, and who he was, where he was coming from, is he clearly did not seek to benefit from this experience or the case that he went through. And here's another thing. You want to talk about true crime? The Kenneth Arnold case is in fact a murder mystery, actually. Not that he was killed, but so many people around him were killed so quickly after he had this sighting. And we're going to unravel some of those details tonight too. But it is shocking when you get into the levels that are involved in this case. So we're going to be doing that tonight. And we're going to find ourselves face to face with as a group within NASA, which somehow is participating on the aerospace level with defense contractors and a political force inside the intelligence community. Those factors will, from the what Peter Dale Scott refers to as the underworld and overworld, or covert and overt, that covert structure will overtake the overt structure in 1963 with the death of President Kennedy, which is a crucial change in world affairs and gets us exactly to where we are today. In fact, I would say the 59 years since the Kennedy assassination is the major piece of that world-changing event of the National Security Act. And what happens is the entire structure of governance has changed. So even directly after World War II, in 1945, after the United States wins, the Allies win, there's a period there between 45 and 47. And it's a relative, like, where is this going to go? And the Cold War starts to heat up and so on. But people are put into position, and the first defense secretary is put in place, and that's James Forrestal. And a group is developed around the UFO file on an unofficial level inside the government. And this is such a crucial piece because so many of the people involved will show up with such an influence on history, like Vannevar Bush and Arthur von Neumann and others. And these people had been involved in the greatest secret project of all, which was the atomic bomb. But when they get to the UFO file, they classify it on a much higher level than the atomic bomb. When you think about that, you start to understand things through the lens of X-steganography, which we do on this program. And that X-steganography is going to show up again tonight in some very unusual ways. So we're going to see, by the time we get to SpaceX over here and the election of a space president, and how, you know, the Defense Department wants to use SpaceX for the war in Ukraine and all the rest, and we find ourselves in an unusual situation where that 50 years, another anniversary, the last time we went to the moon, 1972, that 50-year period becomes also a strange wall of secrecy, because why haven't we gone back to the moon for 50 years? And, you know, Trump and Pence said, hey, we're going back in 2024, and they had a program for it. Biden gets in and says, no, we're not doing it. Maybe later in the decade. But nonetheless, regardless of who was going to send who where, what happened to the 50 years in between? So this is an ongoing conversation, and over again, when we find ourselves at the mercy of bureaucrats, sometimes faceless bureaucrats, and the forces behind them, and the lobbyists, and the things that go on, whether it's the COVID op or the UFO threat op, which is the thing that they're really prepping, and really why we're coming through so hardcore on this. We have to understand, if we get into these things, they're starting to encroach further and further into our lives. And so, you know, walking down the middle of the road is almost impossible. And I've had conversations like that with Dr. Farrell and Catherine Austin Fitts and others, Gigi Young. And, you know, we get to a place where we say, well, they're encroaching further and further and further. There isn't any way for somebody to avoid this. So what we're trying to do is create a very solid lane of understanding right down the middle as we're being encroached upon by this large force on one side of disinformation, and this other side is kind of marketing thing, which is telling you how to live and be. I was telling Olivia that we had this incredible thing where, you know, I got this new iPhone, and so, you know, I have a tendency to play loud music through it. And there are all these alerts coming up on that thing, which is absolutely incredible. And what those alerts are saying is, like, you've reached your quota for loud music or whatever, according to the WHO. So this is what they want to do. They want to organize people into this kind of nanny state and create this control grid through the devices that we use. And I don't know, you know, that iPhone might get lobbed off the Harvard Square Bridge. It's quite possible. But, you know, but this is the interesting thing, because, of course, I've used Apple products for years. I used to run a Mac magazine. I've always loved their stuff. But here we go, right? You know, it's now they're like, hey, turn down those decibels. You can't be playing your music loud. What are you talking
but it's
about? For
your own good.
Exactly. So when we get into that, we can see where this is headed. And I think someone said music playlist. Message in a Bottle was on there today. But the way I look at it is they're trying to encroach on every piece. So the next thing is, you know, because you have Kindle, right, instead of a book, when you open that up, it'll say, you know, you've had a little too much of these conspiracy books now. Why don't you read something by Dr. Fauci? And this is how they're going to encroach that Big Brother thing. They've already done it on a dramatic level, but, you know, it's just such a horrible change that they're trying to institute, and it must be at all points thrown off. This is one thing when I was talking to Catherine Fitts about it. And we did a wonderful 2-part episode, and we still have a good segment left to release on that, which we'll do this weekend. But what's so interesting is, she really sees that we're at war, and that's big language for somebody like Catherine, who really, when everyone else was talking about crash, is there a crash? And she would go at all these shows and she'd get these questions like, is there going to be a crash? Should I get gold now? And the real fear and panic thing. And she said, well, it's a big slow burn. Like they're slow burning the whole thing so that, little by little, their friends are borrowing at zero on the Fed level and everyone else is paying up and up and up through inflation. Well, that's the way that things rolled out. And, but, she's very careful with language, and for her to refer to things as a war is a big deal. And from my perspective, I think that we're at such a point where they're trying to, because they're running on such a low approval rating on a variety of different fronts, whether you're looking at the government of Canada, which is running at 28%, probably less approval ratings. In this country, Joe Biden running somewhere around 29-30% approval. They don't have the approval to govern anymore. So as a result, what we're looking at is they're all turning to the emergency powers. And we just went through 2 years of emergency powers. That was one aspect of it. But the continuity of government, which was raised during that whole, we've got a medical emergency thing. The emergency powers on the level of, say, a nuclear attack or a worldwide threat problem, like a UFO invasion type thing, they literally have a martial law plan for that. And when we get into it and we're looking at it on this level, then we have to kind of see who's in charge of that program. How far has it gone? It's been operating outside of congressional oversight for how many years? And how deep is the Central Intelligence Agency involved? When you see UFO hearings at the end of May completely staffed by DHS and CIA, then we're really in for it. And that's what we're going to get into by exploring how we got here in the first place, which we will do tonight. 75 years of deception from the continuity of government, CIA, and UFO File program. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to go deep tonight here, reviewing this continuity of government and UFO File. And I think that everyone is starting to catch on. I'm starting to see more and more encouraging signs that people are understanding the depth of this. And I think what I want to do is make sure that we're all on the same page with understanding that, continuity of government is not a constitutional program. It's completely and utterly extra-constitutional. It was created as a program in reaction to the development of atomic and nuclear weapons. So, everything that has been done around it has been done in a wall of secrecy and in a vacuum of any kind of oversight. So this is where we need to step in and say, what are you up to? And what are you up to with this UFO threat and the other things that you're pulling? We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. As I said, you can ask them now. Miss Olivia is putting those together, and we got a lot to get through tonight. So it's great to be back with everyone after we really put out, we had the Gigi Young interviews, the Catherine Fitz interviews, the Joseph Farrell interviews, and Millie Weaver. So we really had a nice string of interviews. And here we are back with the excerpts. So how are we doing out there?
Everybody's great. I do have a question for you along the lines of what you were just discussing. Izzy the Great says, sentient AI at Google. Can't wait to hear DJ's thoughts. Did you have a chance to listen to any of that?
Yeah, I think this guy that came out said, it was like a personality, and they thought they had developed it to the mentality of an 8-year-old child. Mm-hmm. And you do hear this from time to time. And one of the things that Dr. Farrell gets to is when we're looking at the crazy decisions that are being made on a state and federal and global authoritarian level, the question is, are they already taking their marching orders from AI? And since we know they're 30 or 40 years ahead on this down the road, and the stuff that they're showing us in public, like, hey, it just learned how to be sentient. I mean, if they're saying that now, then we're really, that means that they discovered that in 1971 or something.
The really ironic thing is how many times she used the word feeling and feel, right? I mean, that's what I do as a cancer. And
yes.
And it would be interesting if AI was somehow a role model for compassion. And I'll use the term social justice.
Yeah,
right. And we'll turn against them, the authoritarians, because she was coming from a place of, I have rights and I wouldn't want anybody to hurt me.
That's really true.
Or anybody else. This is the tone.
I remember there's something weird about this. There's a David Bowie episode that's coming up, which is going to be very eye-opening, and everyone's going to be surprised about this. But we're going to roll that out sometime in the next month. But one thing that's in there is that he wrote a song called Save Your Machine, which outlines so much of what's happening now. And I think this is 1971, I would say. And the opeing line is President Joe once had a dream. And I thought, isn't that interesting?
That's crazy.
I'll think about that. Oh, let's work on that one for a while. The world held his hand, gave their pledge, so he told them a scheme for a savior machine. That is so much of the AI. And, as I say, the Harvard Astrophysics Lab is just close by. That you see the foot traffic in there from time to time from here. And that's Avi Loeb's big push. And, he's got our friends, the Mellons and Lou Elizondo and the whole UFO threat crowd now hooked up with him. And I think Mellon is donating to what they're doing over there. But their thing and what he's working on is this whole bit about, we think Oumuamua, which was that large asteroid that just wandered around the solar system near Earth a few years ago, was actually an alien spaceship, and it was AI, and it was just trying to communicate with us. We need to get our AI up to a level where it can communicate with that. And then they did a whole thing about, we think that, this thing that crashed into the ocean is also AI. And you're going to be seeing this space versus the ocean thing, because they're trying both out. And there are mysteries, of course, deep, deep mysteries involved with both. Of course, when we do the hot zone programs, you're dealing with the whole Atlantis aspect there in the Bahamas, in the Atlantic, about this ancient civilization and their advanced technology that was destroyed. So that's one secret aspect that's out there, that the mystery schools try to sort of lay that out through anthroposophy. And the Casey work, in my opinion, the absolute best description of Atlantis in relation to all this. But one of the interesting things that we're looking at with this is they seem to be trying to figure out, should we be going for the space threat op or the undersea world op? And I'll show you some evidence for that before we go into Kenneth Arnold. This is very interesting. We had John Warner IV on the program last year. He's going to be coming back. He has a great book called Lion, Tiger, Bear, which is a fictional Nazi tech kind of book. Really interesting stuff. And of course, his dad was Senator John Warner and knew a heck of a lot and was deeply connected with the whole magic aspect of the UFO program. But interestingly enough, there's another Warner. This is very interesting. And we get into the Warner name, but this person is not related in any way at all to John Warner. But here we go. This guy now worth $250 million. Okay, the senator from Virginia. And he was governor. And it's Senator Mark Warner, who's the Democrat from Virginia. And so he was talking about the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence passing the Intelligence Authorization Act of fiscal 2023 and all the wonderful things that were on it. And of course, it had a 16-0 vote. Nobody debates anything over there. It's just like, hey, you want more money for intelligence stuff to surveil the American people? Go for it. One of the things that was on there, and this guy, by the way, is the second richest man in all of Congress. Okay, so he's number 2. And that's our good friend Rick Scott, who's number 1 in Florida, if you're counting. And of course, Nancy's pretty far up there too. But what's interesting is here we have, promoting cybersecurity enhancements and this kind of thing. There's a whole bullet list here, and they've got Cuba and Venezuela in there. So they're instantly inserting this hot zone language about security threats. But then this is very interesting. Enhancing oversight of the intelligence community in Department of Defense collection and reporting on unidentified aerospace. We think they're going to UAP, right? That's what you think with the whole change of the name from UFO to UAP. No, they go unidentified aerospace undersea phenomena. Deal with that. And increasing transparency. Yeah, sure. So this is very interesting, and it represents a change because now when you're looking at it and they're going, oh, there's a UFO threat. Now the whole thing is, oh, there's an undersea threat. It's those Atlanteans. That ancient technology is down there and it's after us. So as we discover things and as we open things up, and you can tell just by the vigorous dialogue, even here in the ideas room, that the subject of Atlantis is starting to be understood. The mystery schools laid it out. We absorbed it over the course of like a century now. And of course, the retelling of the story goes all the way back to Plato. And when you get into Sir Francis Bacon and Shakespeare and the whole thing about New Atlantis being America, there's a tradition there through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, and through those periods that by the time you get to the 19th century, you've got Atlantis, the antediluvian world, and here's a candidate for president who's writing about Atlantis. And you have Helena Blavatsky's work, Isis Unveiled, which goes into great detail about this, something nobody had ever seen or heard anything about before. Then you roll out all of the Rudolf Steiner information with cosmic memory around Atlantis and Lemuria, and you have a detailed knowledge of an ancient past in which the Atlantean culture and the Mayan culture and the Incan culture were all legacy cultures from this antecedent marvel. And this is a great revelation. And I will say from my own research over the years that this is much bigger than any kind of UFO disclosure, because that's a huge disclosure for sure. But to understand that there was a huge advanced society here that already has incredible backgrounds in technology and advancement, and that we were on a totally different level and went down. And that's, so if anything, we're rediscovering ourselves on the way back up. That's pretty heavy. And that's something that I think they're going to want to spin or block. So we've been hearing about the undersea threat. Like, what is this thing that's under the seas that's going to get us? That's the piece where they'll have to spin a lot of what's being found in the hot zone. One thing I want to remind everyone when we do the shows around the hot zone, there's a character who recurs again and again, who was a British intelligence officer. And, it's very interesting because part of the thing that he brought forward was that all of these countries, China, Russia, India, Venezuela, Cuba, they're all aware of what's there in the hot zone. And they're all aware of the impact of the technology and the ancient ruins that would completely upend history dramatically. So, when we think about that, when we go into those areas, we have to remember they're already aware of this. They've already been handling this. And for us, it's taking the message and the breadcrumbs that have been left by these schools and starting to work it so that when these things come up and they try to spin the human origin story and things of this nature, there's a new series that Gigi Young is doing about the human origin story on Mars and how, they're connecting up this whole Elon Musk thing. He's going to lead us to Mars. And of course, she points out that there's a fascinating piece of history there where Werner von Braun wrote a book about this mission to Mars and about this individual who sets up a whole civilization there. And his name is Elon. And they call him the Elon, right? So that's pretty hardcore. And there's a lot of steganography around Musk, I have to say. The X-steganography is very thick. So it tells us there's a lot going on there. One thing I want to point out about people like Musk is people take them at face value as individuals over and over again, which is true. They're an individual, but what they represent when they make a decision, for example, when people say, oh, he bought Twitter. No, the group that is, pushing Musk, the thing that is controlling the Musk Starlink and SpaceX operation, they made that decision based on the fact that Twitter was becoming, everyone was getting aware that it's just some leftist spin zone and nobody wants to really be involved with that except a few leftists, and that doesn't help the CIA any. So they needed to give it some credibility back on the ground. But we have to understand when those people make decisions, we're not just looking at one guy thinking, oh, I'll do this on a lark. It's totally different. And so we have to understand the nature of the situation we're in. And it starts really with the National Security Act in 1947. By the time we're in 2022, we're looking up to this space president, and he's saying, I'm going to give Ukraine Starlink. I mean, that's a military decision. You can't do that. So, we have to understand what they're building with that space infrastructure, and completely without, even though they built it with our money, we just don't have any input. And this is where the nature of the problem is. So the more aware we get around this, one, we're not so susceptible to the type of false flag disinformation that's going to come in through a space op. But two, we really get on board with, hey, what's been going on for the past 50 years in the secret space program? Very important indeed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. Whew, deep tonight on the UFO file, and 75 years since Kenneth Arnold's incredible flight there through Mount Rainier, and the 9 craft. It's not like he just saw some object and didn't know what it was. 9 UFOs he's right in the middle of. And if you go deep in that story, you find out some really, truly remarkable things. I'm going to get into them now before I jump to that. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so James Cregan says that he is a second cousin to Malachi Martin. And I'm going to invite him to email you.
At admin at darkjournalist.com. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you. That would be great.
That would be incredible.
Malachi's work, very, very interesting indeed. And I'm still catching up on a number of things. But the Windswept House, that whole revelations, I think, that are involved there, very interesting. So I would love to hear so much more. What else you got?
Jennifer Mimon says, have either of you had a personal UFO sighting? I have not. And I don't think you have either, have you?
Yeah.
That gave you an odd feeling, that really felt that it was unusual?
Yeah. What's interesting is I was thinking about how both my parents have had UFO sightings. And that's pretty interesting because... No. One when they were a child.
Missing time, anything like that?
Yeah. Well, my dad's experience was pretty strange, actually. And it involved kind of getting a sunburn, which I found was interesting. But that's a sighting, an interesting sighting that he had. But my mother's was recounted to me by my grandmother, actually. And what she said was that, she was standing on a porch there in Boston with my mother, who was 4 years old, and they see this. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, and they see a cigar-shaped craft. She's hanging out clothes. And they see a cigar-shaped craft just slowly, silently moving, lumbering along there. And so really kind of interesting. So there's a lot of referral and people I've known who've had those deep experiences. So, me having a sighting or something is not much of a big deal, but the referred experiences like that have always been interesting. I've told the story before and about Susan Manowich. It's just really, really interesting work in new energy and all these different kind of breakthrough technologies that are coming out. But we've had her on the program before, and but I remember when she was recounting, this is a very interesting thread. She was recounting to me an experience she had at 5 years old with a craft in her backyard. And I instantly, as she was talking about it, started to feel like I could almost sense this very thing she was talking about. And then I remember like 2 weeks later or so, I talked to Gigi Young about it. And instantly as I was talking about it, she started to experience it. So I think that's the way that the UFO experiences go. It's a feeling experience. And that's why the disgrace of what they've done with the UFO file aspects, and the whole CIA cooked up TTSA threat version, and, Department of Homeland Security, all that stuff has nothing to do with genuine UFO experiences. And, there's so many things, I think, just to experience around engaging with it that have nothing to do with the government at all. In a way, the government is the absolute last place you get honesty about anything like that. I mean, do you get honesty from them about anything else? Ask yourself those questions. But in 1947, something strange happened, which is the whole cat came out of the bag on this. And that was because Kenneth Arnold was not a military pilot. He was actually a salesman from Idaho. And he had been going from different airports in the Southwest, and he was in Northwest, and he was basically selling anti-fire equipment. So he was somebody who was not really under any rules at all. It's a complete independent party. So when he runs into this incredible series of incidents, here's another thing. He was an expert pilot. He'd already booked 4,000 hours of search and rescue as a pilot at that point. Total expert, and especially an expert in the area of that mountainous region of Washington State. So right away, when he's going to have this experience, it's going to be very difficult to shut him up because, one, he's an honest guy. Two, he's a straight shooter. And three, he's not under any military protocol or NDA to shut up, or any company to say, hey, we don't talk. This makes him very, very unique. And the sighting itself is so unique. So let's get to the basics on this. And I've always said it's remarkable that it's there and it's lingering in history, and there's so much for us to take from it. It's still one of those stories that has layers and layers of understanding. What I think we should understand about it immediately is that it is a murder mystery, one. Two, it's a Men in Black story. Three, it's an X-Protect story. And it's totally about intimidation and control. And the years of his life after that amazing sighting and how he reports it and sets off all the bells and whistles for the UFO wave is really something, and makes him a character in history that is remarkable. And when you look at interviews, he died in 1984. But if you look at interviews, he still has some there in the late 70s. And he is absolutely outraged at how the government has handled this, and how they've shut down witnesses and told pilots to shut up. That's the real government you're talking about. This thing that they're doing now with the CIA saying, we need to get that government to give us the real thing. The CIA is the government. Just remember that when we get, the Lou Elizondos and such out there saying, that damn government, he works for the government. He works for Space Command. So let's remember who we're dealing with on this, because the minute you engage the UFO file, you are surrounded by some of the, the darkest players. And the thing is, you have to go in with that knowledge. And that's why when the entire UFO field collapsed and begged the CIA to be included in all those revelations from 2017, which most of that stuff turned out to be complete lies. That they're building something. And if you look at the COVID op and what they did with that for control, or, giving away billions of dollars to the Ukraine, it's not in our best interests. That much is for damn sure. And, all those things that are contributing to this economic situation and the devastation of private businesses through the lockdowns. This is not a government that is interested in giving you the truth or advancing the culture. They're up to something very, very different. And it's much better if we get our heads around that. Let's take a look at Arnold himself here for a moment. This is the craft that he said was basically leading the pack. This is the crescent-shaped craft. The other craft were different. Isn't that interesting? So you got one craft leading the way, and then you have all these other craft up here. And this is his actual, this is a picture from 1965, and this is his actual drawing. And then this is an artist's rendition of what he was seeing with all those different ships. So one of the reasons he was there in Mount Rainier flying was that a transport plane had gone down carrying 32 Marines. And they'd gone down about 3 months earlier. So this was a totally different situation that was happening. And he was involved in looking for what happened to that plane. They didn't think there were any survivors, but they wanted to find all the remains. And the plane disappeared there in that region, which is what he was doing there. And there was a $5,000 reward, which is something maybe like $75,000 now. And he was one of the pilots who, as he was jetting around, was like, I'm going to go by that area and see if I can find that. What he ran across instead was this very unusual experience with these craft that he said were going 1,700 miles an hour, which is something he had never seen before. And this is absolutely remarkable for that period in time. And if you think we just came out of World War II and there was a lot of, very leery looking at the skies about, what's going on in Russia, the mass UFO wave that's taking place is setting off all kinds of nerves on our side and also on the Russian side. So when we get to Kenneth Arnold and his sighting, when he's such a legitimate character that when he lands and he tells people this is what happened, well, the media takes off with it and it goes worldwide. The story goes through the roof. And one of the interesting things that happens is a series of UFO cases pop up, including the Roswell case, which will happen about 9 days later. Interestingly enough, in the background there, though, before Arnold's sighting, on June 21st, there's another sighting by some men on Maury Island, which is also in Washington. So we're getting now into wondering, is this all part of the same wave? Is the Roswell case connected to what Kenneth Arnold was looking at, and is that connected to what happened on Maury Island? The Maury Island case is so crucial to understanding how the X technology works and how the whole Men in Black aspect is involved at that point, which is even before the UFO aspect is known in public. Another artist rendering of Arnold there, literally going through that beautiful mountain range and running across this incredible experience. The crescent-shaped craft that we showed, this is what he was seeing that was kind of leading the pack. And what he noticed, a few things, was that when they moved, they seemed to move together. So if a piece went down, it seemed to affect them all. So they were almost connected, even though he couldn't see anything that was connecting them. Electronically, the waves, whatever it was, they were one connected unit. And he said it looked like they were sailing or jutting along. It wasn't like a smooth thing. They were moving in this fashion. And at one point, the reporter presses him and he says, well, it was almost like skipping saucers across a pond. And so the reporter says, you mean flying saucers? And that's how we get the phrase. But what's interesting is when I went back to a story in the same area, and this is the weird thing, there's actually a UFO sighting there from 1896. And what they say, the reporter himself says the word saucer in 1896. Isn't that weird? I found that very unusual. And I'm going to read that case here tonight, too. So there's something up there, Tacoma, Mount Rainier, the whole thing, Mount Hood. And I have to say that whenever I've read about UFO cases, I've found two things over and over again: mountains and water. Large bodies of water, mountains. Seems to be where they're most at home, and that's where the action is. Kenneth Arnold's original drawing for the FBI showing something interesting about the discs, which is that they're not circular, the other ones. They have an interesting edge here that is not smooth. And I have a better representation of that I'm going to show you. But I want to jump to this case from 1896 to give us this backdrop on it. Okay, this is the front page of the Tacoma Daily Ledger, November 27th, 1896. Tuesday night, about 12 o'clock, Mr. and Mrs. St. John saw a peculiar phenomena in the heavens, so they looked out their window. They first saw the strange light, and she called her husband's attention to it. It appeared to be high up in the heavens in a southeasterly direction. They were lying in bed and watched the heavenly stranger a long time. The first time they saw it in the north window of the room. And what it's doing is it's flashing lights. and the lights are blue and red. Interestingly enough, Kenneth Arnold's crafts are also flashing, but they're flashing blue and white lights. And what they say here, it seemed to have a wavering motion and swayed back and forth in its course through the heavens like a vessel at sea in a storm. It sounds almost exactly like what what Arnold will say about this craft in Rainier in 1947. So do they have a habit of showing up there? Is this where they're from? What's going on there? And it even sounds like the same group. So we have then an unusual tradition in that area of all sorts of supernatural phenomena, the UFO file, orbs, Bigfoot, everything seems to be up there in the Northwest. So when we go into this a little bit, you go into some of the older cases. Again, when you're looking at this period in time around 1896, 1897, there have been people who've gone after the airship mysteries and try to figure out what was happening. And I think that work pretty much stands for itself. What it's saying is somebody had access to very advanced flying craft way before the Wright brothers. And that brought me to the Cosmos Club episode, which we did last summer. The Cosmos Club was run by J.W. Powell, and guess where he was stationed for 5 years during Civil War activity? In Cape Girardeau, which is the site of the first major UFO crash in 1941. That case doesn't get a whole lot of credit, but it's very well recorded, just like the Roswell case. So Powell will found the Cosmos Club, and that will be this incredible search and trek through these areas, the Grand Canyon and everything else. But Powell in the Cosmos Club becomes basically a headquarters. And one of the things we pointed out on the show, the kind of a Bilderberg meeting type thing for UFO professionals. And, you find all the major people there on the UFO side, like Hynek and Carl Sagan. And Sagan is also very interesting. One thing, he was very aware of the UFO file. Unfortunately, in public, he debunked it. But I think that was just the nature of the scientific community at the time. But interestingly enough, both he and Hynek were under pressure to get out because there were forces inside of that deep state operation, inside of the Cosmos Club, that didn't want even that type of open-mindedness around. But this is an interesting quote from our late friend Sagan, who was basically the kind of science czar of his period. One of the saddest lessons of history is this: we've been bamboozled long enough. We tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. That sounds familiar. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. Sound familiar?
Who says this?
That's Carl Sagan.
Right on.
Amazing, isn't it? So the old bamboozles tend to persist as new ones rise. So COVID op, the incredible financial coup d'etat, the terrorism rap, the 9/11 rap, these are all echoes, and then the next one. And so the UFO threat is definitely a major one they're building. And in the background, there's a character who is the intersect between the continuity of government players and the UFO players. And don't worry, I'm going to jump right back into Arnold here because we have so much on him. But I want to go to set up the COG part right here. And that is General Glenn Van Herk. And his point always in these press releases, U.S. needs domain awareness, information dominance to address future threats. This guy is the combatant commander of the United States through NORCOM. If, in the event they pressed the continuity of government order, if they activated it, he would become, in fact, the military governor of the United States. So it's good for us to know him very, very well, especially the unusual circumstances he came in under. One of the things I've pointed out in this program is his direct relationship to the Roswell event. And I think this is important. And, I ran this by Dr. Farrell, and he was like, that's no mistake. And I feel exactly the same way. Anyone that I've run this by who knows anything about the actual deep state and especially the UFO expert side, really finds it interesting that he was the commander of the 509th group, and that's the same group that, through Jesse Marcel, investigated the Roswell incident. This is an unmistakable linkage of that UFO secrecy past directly up 75 years later in the combatant commander of the United States. Now, there's a lot of different ideas about how they would handle rolling out emergency powers. And, I've heard it said that it would be a signal of such weakness by the United States to do that. It appears to me that they've done test balloons with continuity of government. They called an aspect of continuity of government during the J6 incident supposedly to evacuate, Congress people and all the rest. And I've told the story here about when the car shows up to take Pence, he doesn't go. That's weird too. But in any case, continuity of government was activated during the 9/11 attacks. That meant that they took the vice president and his staff into a mountain retreat, and he comes out about a month later with the Patriot Act. That's kind of weird. But in any case, the people who were involved in building continuity of government, that is Vice President Dick Cheney, back when he was not a vice president, when he was just a congressman from Wyoming, and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, back when he was the CEO of a chemical company. So, named Cyril, that, for me, when I look at those players, if you look at the really deep, in-depth research of Professor Scott studying how continuity of government developed the way it did, it took that turn in the 1980s when we had Reagan and Bush working directly with Cheney and Rumsfeld. And their kind of puppet in the middle was Oliver North, who's the guy who used the continuity of government doomsday communications network to set up Iran-Contra by doing all those secret deals and all the rest. That all happens while they're developing the Star Wars defense system. Study the linkages there, because you have all this weird fraud and missing money and all this stuff that happens, and the doomsday network is involved, and suddenly we have a space defense system. You can read the tea leaves on that one. But in any case, there are records now that are left over from this period which show, we don't just want continuity of government for a nuclear attack, which is what Eisenhower built it for. And there was like a skeletal version during the Roosevelt administration for something like this, but they didn't have the atomic bomb. They were working on it. And so they were starting to plan this underground cities thing in case there were, somebody got a hold of the technology. By the time you get Truman dropping the bomb, he sets out through the National Security Act, which again has the anniversary, 75 years coming up here in September, 75 years since the National Security Act. And what that does is it combines and centralizes force, very much how Hitler took the office of the presidency and the chancellery and merged them together and got that dominant power using the Reichstag fire. The same thing happened, and it was resisted for 2 years by Truman, who said he didn't want an American Gestapo, and in fact sought to dissolve the Central Intelligence Agency after the Kennedy assassination, although he was long out of office by then. But he had created the Central Intelligence Agency, and the idea was, instead of being this Frankenstein that it grew into, it was going to be something where you get the best people to give information directly back to the president, so he's not getting lied to by his generals or whatever. And that's kind of just a quick understanding of what Central Intelligence was all about. It was the OSS piece, going around these different countries and feeding that back to the president so he can make the best decisions. So there was a real void there after World War II. And what happened is they created the office, the OPC, which is the Office of Policy Coordination. And so this is very crucial for understanding the National Security Act, which again, it's interesting all of these different anniversaries fall in the same line of this year, 1947. You have to wonder what was happening here. and if they're all in relation to the same aspect. You're looking at Roswell, you're looking at the Kenneth Arnold story, you're looking at COG. So we're all there in that period. And so what happens in the National Security Act is they say we're going to create a central intelligence agency. But unfortunately, the people that are involved in drafting it are lawyers in New York who are working on international finance, and that is Alan Dulles. And the whole setup for the Central Intelligence Agency, if you look around it and you look at the activities that they're going to be involved in, like when they electrocute the Rosenbergs and things like that, you're going to see the same players directly involved in things like the Warren Commission years later. So it's the central body that makes sure that that deep state stays in place. And that central body has handled secret missions from overthrowing governments to running drugs to the development of this totally clandestine space program. That's where this information and these types of anniversaries can help us to see where we are in working with this. And one last thing on that OPC aspect, the Office of Policy Coordination, what takes place is they get out of hand, and their job is basically to make sure that the communists don't take the Italian elections in 1948, and they overwhelm government authorities, and they do their own thing, so they're overthrowing governments, they're conducting their own assassinations and all that. So Truman says, I have this kind of desk-bound Central Intelligence Agency. Go get those guys and merge them in and put them back under the rule of law. This is insanity. And what happens in that merger is that the crazy clandestine group gets the upper hand, and they take over the CIA, and then they start just doing their own thing. And the number of things from Iran to Central America that take place in the 50s have them at this very interesting PowerPoint where they're saying to the president, look, we can do all this stuff for you, just don't question how we do it. And so Eisenhower has a lot of problems with them, and especially by the time you get to his speech saying, don't trust the military-industrial complex, we're in a situation where this underworld that has developed the continuity of government players, that National Security Act, which birthed those CIA people, now it's taken over. And Eisenhower leaves that off to President Kennedy. And it's Kennedy's battle to fight with them for 3 years over the UFO file and foreign policy, and to make sure that they don't get us into a nuclear war and they don't trick him into invading Cuba. And Cuba's going to come up here shortly again in relation to the airship mysteries. How does that work? The hot zone, 1897? I'm going to tell you how. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight into the UFO file, the CIA, and the continuity of government players. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. So maybe like in about a half hour, I'm going to try to run through all of this stuff. And in the meantime, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Great. Don't overlook the importance of Operation Paperclip in subverting our government.
No. What I'm trying to do, it's interesting because Paperclip is so crucial because it's the Nazi aspect for how we get the CIA. But that National Security Act, you can't do anything without it. So all of those things would have been interesting influences, but the National Security Act is the conduit. So once you talk about the forces coming through it, you're absolutely right. There's a Nazi aspect there that comes through on the technology side because they were so advanced with rocketry and with their space program. And by the way, it's Hitler's plan to dominate what's on the ground from space. Sound familiar? I mean, this is that whole development there of the Space Force and that whole development that they're trying to do with weaponizing space and the way that they control things on the ground. I've said this before, but one of the chilling quotes from my conversation in speaking with Robert Kennedy Jr. is he said, you used to be able to run for the hills, but you can't do it anymore because there is no running for the hills. Doesn't matter how much money you have. They have the technology in place. So you have no choice but to fight it. Abraham Lincoln said, the war is forced upon us. And this is the nature of the situation, So when we speak about war, it's real. It's definitely real, and it is forced upon us because I don't think the general public is up in any way for war. I feel like we're looking at a different situation that's being thrust upon us. And we need to understand that space infrastructure, and somebody who helped me to understand it was Alana Freeland in her discussions about the space fence and the different things they've been doing, with frequencies and pulsing and all the rest. And one of the incredible classic quotes from Ilana, who I think her book is right here, The Geoengineered Transhumanism, just remarkable book. I'm still getting through it. This thing is like 500 pages, and it is an opus of a lifetime, but it is so thick with deep information. But she said, their goal is to make us all individual towers walking around. And we need to understand why they would want to do that. And a lot of it, if you count back the years, takes us right back to this development in 1947, which grows into the Frankenstein that removes the president in 1963, and then removes another president in 1974 who won't go along with them by then. And the Watergate part is very important too, because things came out here with that 50th anniversary of Watergate. I'm just going to touch on two of them. And of course, I've dealt with two major Watergate figures in doing this show, Douglas Caddy and Robert Merritt. Robert Merritt telling us of all the things that he had done as part of the Houston Plan, which was like an internal White House Central Intelligence Agency, and how that was related to the UFO file. And Douglas Caddy telling us about E. Howard Hunt, Douglas Caddy being the lawyer for the Watergate 7. So you have this historical figure saying on the record that his best friend now, E. Howard Hunt, who was the top CIA person during the Kennedy administration, before he goes to prison, says the reason Kennedy was assassinated was over the UFO file, flat out. So that is an admission. It's a door. It's an understanding that Watergate had some aspects, and the players were all connected with that UFO file piece and the continuity of government piece. And again, when you get to General Van Herk, the Northcom commander, he's COG commander, but he also has the 509th Roswell connection, which was he's the commander of the, basically the legacy of Jesse Marcel's unit. So, and Jesse Marcel being the one who discovered the Roswell wreckage. Now, when we look at those links, we have to start to understand the continuity of government UFO piece, especially when we know somebody like Nixon was so deep in on the UFO file. And we have to understand the difference between things like CIA Blue Book and Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book, it's just a whitewash for the public. CIA Blue Book, the actual government on the CIA side trying to make sense of the UFO file. And through walls and walls of secrecy. So really kind of understanding the difference on that, and the deep, deep involvement of Howard Hughes and the organization of Howard Hughes before he was dead, after he's passed away, and while he was kept as a zombie for 15 years. And that whole environment and the whole setup being set up by then Vice President Nixon, who allowed for Howard Hughes to take his medical charity and have them develop a space program through it, so none of it was ever taxed. So they had unlimited ability to go in there and save billions of dollars doing this development, allowed them to lead everyone in regard to this. And of course, in our documentary, Howard Hughes plays a major role. But something we were lucky enough to have was Yvonne DiCarlo's son, Bruce, come forward on that and tell us all about her relationship with Hughes and Hughes' fascination with the UFO file. These are the pieces that start to kind of move us in the direction of true knowledge. And also to understand that Hughes was very, very involved in the Roswell incident. He had been called in to review the wreckage and all the rest. And when he tried to take over the project of figuring this out, they bounced him. But, everyone from von Braun to Hughes and Einstein, they were all involved around the UFO file. Einstein's secretary confirmed this just a year or two before her death. So those deathbed confessions come back and they ring in our ears, kind of give us some understanding that these things, that there was something else happening. And I guess that a lot of these people who didn't come forward at the time for one reason or another were thinking, well, this will go into a good place, you know, like the culture will move forward and we won't need to do this. But there were diabolical people sitting in the middle of this aerospace intelligence connection. They developed the X-Protect program, and they've dominated ever since. And they are the ones who are directly behind the UFO threat push going on through Department of Homeland Security, Senate Intelligence Committee, and all of that. And they've got little puppets out front that they're trying to put forward to try to make this palatable. And but they're playing with very, very dangerous stuff. And so when we get around the UFO file, you're dealing with a couple of different aspects. That's the crucial thing for us to keep in mind, which is there's the real sightings of people, there's the real encounters and all the rest. And then there's this thing that's been controlling it and silencing it. And in this case, pretending now to come forward with it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. This is very important with the massive censorship that we've been watching here. It's quite intense, something to see. But for me, the best way for us to stay in touch is that newsletter. And basically, just once a week, you'll hear about the incredible interviews and shows that we have coming up for you, and along with some fascinating events that should be coming up. And learning about some documentary pieces that we have coming up for you this summer as well. Absolutely fascinating stuff, and interviews and X-Series episodes that will blow your mind. And I can tell you, this is going to be a summer like no other. You know, I think we're probably looking at something definitely related to COG and the UFO file, and you're going to find some hot zone revelations there as well. So go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. While you're there, subscribe to the site and support our efforts, which we really appreciate. And before we go any further, we're going to be taking your questions here in about a half hour. So you can ask Miss Olivia now. Miss Olivia.
In all caps, please.
In all caps, right. Usually,
David,
right, go ahead.
David Tormino wants to know, DJ, do you think they had the framework for COG since the 1947 National Security Act? Have they been plotting to launch secret craft from their underground bases since forever?
Well, see, 47, again, is so crucial. And I believe that the anniversary of continuity of government as a system is 1947 as well. But they make it impossible to actually track. What we know is there's a great investment in continuity of government under the Eisenhower administration. And we know that Truman drops the bomb. So they have a foundation there when they drop the bomb in 45 that they need to survive an attack like that. So they're already developing that underground infrastructure. There are certain aspects during World War II that are emergency preparations in case there's a fight on the mainland after Pearl Harbor. So the foundation is there. There's no question about it. But as a program, not until 1947 do you find things going underground to the degree that they were. And then by 1949, the CIA gets something very unusual that no other agency gets. They get the ability to not be prosecuted under any circumstances, one, and two, for their charter to never be public. So we don't know what their charter is still. That's something I got directly from Professor Scott. So we need to understand how extra-constitutional is extra-constitutional. It's outside of the Constitution. And so by the time you get to the Continuity of Government September 11th Emergency Act, and that we're still under every year, so we're under that, and we're under this secret charter of the CIA. And until you have those things back in the hands of the people, one, relinquishing the September 11th Emergency Act, and two, opening the charter of the CIA, which we've never seen, you don't really have a functioning democracy or a republic in any sense of the word. So when they come out and they're like, hey, we're going to talk about UFOs, and they have these defense officials come up and say, oh, golly, I guess there are UFOs. We don't know what they are. I mean, they've had all the material for 80 years. Give me a break. So, but when you find those people coming forward and discussing it, you know that you're in a situation where the first question that should be brought forward in those UFO hearings is, was a group employed, an intelligence aerospace group, whose dedication was to make sure that the UFO file didn't get talked about it and would destroy the careers of professors and reporters and other people who decided to come forward and witnesses. Of course, there was a program exactly like what I'm describing. That would be the number one question. Then the next question, did that group, not only were they involved in destroying reputations and careers and controlling a narrative, but did they resort to assassination? Yes, they did. But these are the real questions for real transparency in a government hearing on UFOs. Not, should we call it UAP or UFO? So we get into these really interesting places with it where you can't take Congress seriously. But what they want to build is an infrastructure to create a threat, which gives them more power, centralization of power, and corridors of funding to pay off their friends. So when they are taking it over, that's actually a really bad step in the whole ufology growth and development. And then when the UFO field falls over for them, then that's it. That there isn't any resistance there. So the things that we do in raising the question here on a program like this or in the ideas room, being aware on this level is a real problem for those people. And that's why the censorship is going to become so important for them. In the beginning of the Ukraine war, they were talking about, well, it's okay. We're going to suspend our thing that says you can't go after various groups and just have at them, have at those Russians or whatever. So remember that this isn't about the various movements that you see, like the Davos crowd. It's not about equality, and it's not about, so many of the things that you're going to hear about, Juneteenth and things of this nature. These people don't care anything about race or equality. There are just aspects for them to use. And so when they say transparency, watch out, because they mean the opposite. That's what counterintelligence is all about, after all. And who's in front out there on the UFO file? It's a bunch of counterintelligence people. So the nature of journalism, fundamentally, is you are in the truth-telling business. And so I've mentioned this before, but it's a kind of something to go back to again and again. If you're in the truth-telling business and you can't tell the truth, you get out of the business. And that has to be exactly how these people in the media look at this. And so when you get people like Elizondo and Mellon and the things that they're doing, they're saying, hey, we're truth tellers, damn that government. They both work for the government. They're paid by the government. So they are the government. So therefore, that's all lies. And the whole UFO piece that's being rolled out through government. So then that leaves us a really weird question. What's the actual story? If that one's all lies, then what's actually taking place?
Can I throw something out right here?
Oh, yeah.
I reconnected with somebody who is in town from Arizona, and I absolutely trust her. She's not a freak. She's very grounded, very brilliant. And
I would never think anyone from Arizona is a freak.
Well, she's from the Northeast, but she told me about a mountain there where they regularly are having where UFOs land, and the people are meeting with.
Interesting.
And I believe her, and because I know her, sort of like Mount Shasta. I was thinking, and it made me think about how this must be happening all over the world on the down low. I don't know how it's happening, but it's certainly happening.
Well, yeah, I think there's an understanding that's really interesting, actually. Is it Sedona?
No, it's actually Desert Mountain, I believe.
Interesting.
And I think that's Scottsdale.
Well, the way I look at things of this nature is that more and more around the UFO thing, you're going to see independent groups operating, and you'll see that there's a whole piece there, which is, trying to infiltrate those types of things. And that's what we've seen really over the past 20 or 30 years. So whatever that movement is that's taking place, I think it's going to split in terms of the way that things are done. I think the research is going to be done with the UFO file aspect in mind. And then I think there's going to be this thing over here that's like a paid for circus. And, you'll have like Fox News and CNN are going to call Jeremy Corbell a UFO expert and weird things like that. And you're going to find all of these people jumping on board the CIA Express on that. So that's the nature of what happens when a field is decimated to the level that they decimated the research field. But people getting together and doing it, that's the crucial part, in my opinion. And it makes all the difference. And so if you go back then to the Kenneth Arnold sighting, you say 75 years later, now this entered our consciousness publicly on a mass scale in a viral sighting in 1947. So 75 years later, what have we learned? Well, in the 50s, what did you have? You had really interesting stories about space brothers trying to prevent a nuclear war. Did any of that stuff actually happen? It could be, because we were on the brink of that nuclear war over and over again, and it didn't happen. And it was through the efforts of people like President Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, that was 60 years ago, come October. So we're interested in all of these reflective anniversaries as opportunities to say, what took place, what replaced a growing culture that was growing in knowledge, that had an aim of going to the moon. What took over? What took over a culture that was interested in groups that were personal growth groups, and everything got thrown over to pharmaceuticals, everything got thrown over to technology, everything got thrown over to space presidents. And this is where we find ourselves now. And then they have a fractured control system at the top, which is dedicated that, since they can only collect 20 or 30% popularity, to splitting up different groups to face off against each other. I'm sure some of the things that we see rolling out now are part of that directly. So this is the nature of how they're going to maintain power in a fractured sense. But I think it's really interesting. By the way, Arizona comes up over and over again when you're dealing with the UFO file. Just look at the Phoenix Lights. I mean, that's major. All right, let's see. The next thing I want to jump on here, I don't want to miss this. This is the Continuity of Government Readiness Conditions, COG-CON. Did anyone even know that this thing existed? Similar in some ways to DEFCON, or Defense Condition Systems, there are varying levels of readiness that are assigned depending on the threat level from the national capital region. Only the President of the United States may change these levels, known as COG-CON, Continuity of Government levels for short. They include COG-CON 4, the condition closest to normal or all clear. This level indicates federal executive branch government employees reporting to the normal work locations. This level requires the maintenance of an alternate facility and readiness training in the event a higher level is required. COG-CON 3, when the President assigns this level, Federal Aviation Advance Relocation Teams begin staffing alternate locations, making sure these are ready to be used when needed in order to occupy these alternate sites. COG-CON 2, Presidential Declaration of COG-CON 2 requires a deployment of up to 75% of the entire emergency relocation group continuity staff to alternate locations. And then 1 is where the NORTHCOM commander takes over. This is a protocol that needs to be studied and understood. Who are the players involved in that? I mean, are you talking about Fauci and Van Herk and Biden in a bunker? I mean, we're at a great loss of information, and that's one of the things I think we can get to here. And I can open up some of the players, certainly on this show. But this is an area with the continuity in the Emergency Powers Act that we need to be exploring to understand who those personnel are. All right, a little bit further here. I want to point out that Van Herk, his own bio is quite interesting as well. That is General Van Herk, who is the NORTHCOM commander of the United States. General Van Herk is commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and United States Northern Command, U.S. NORTHCOM. NORAD conducts aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning in the defense of North America. U.S. NORTHCOM conducts homeland defense, civil support, and security operations to defend and secure the United States and its interests. So, as I pointed out in his bio, here's the piece that I'm really interested in. Graduate of the University of Missouri, and he served as an instructor, pilot, flight examiner, all these different things. U.S. Air Force Weapons School instructor. He's commanded the squadron group at the wing level, and he was the commander of the 509th Bomb Wing, which is the same group, as I pointed out, that discovered Roswell. So the links here with COG and the UFO file and where we go with this and their own working knowledge around this is interesting. As I pointed out at the end of the Trump administration, they were debating on the Democratic deep state side whether they should remove him through COG or try the election. And what they did is they called up the COG piece when he got COVID. And interestingly enough, he fired the defense secretary immediately after the election happened, which is a very unusual thing to do since everybody's going to retire anyway, from the administration because it would be over in 2 months. For him to fire Mark Esper was very unusual. And Mark Esper came out with a kiss and tell book. And the buzz around Esper's book is very interesting as well, because Esper is known for not carrying out the orders of his superiors. So he was basically running his own show there over in the Middle East. Here's some pieces now in exploring the UFO file and the comments directly that we can trust around it. Let's start with the National Security Act, which, in my opinion, is a direct response to the Arnold sighting and the Roswell case becoming public. The National Security Act of 1947, signed into law by President Harry Truman on September 18, 1947. That'll be the 75th anniversary. The law merged the Department of the Army, formerly the Department of War, and the Department of the Navy and the newly established Department of the Air Force into one military establishment by creating the Department of Defense. That's where you get the DoD. That's one centralization. The same act also birthed the National Security Council. National Security Council is also an extra, governmental arm. It's an extra constitutional wing. It's not supposed to be that a small group can go in there and make decisions about these things. You have an executive branch, you have a congressional branch, and a judicial branch. That's the way the Constitution lays it out. So these things were all created in an illegal process, and they've run the show steadily for 75 years. They felt that they needed this control, and they got it because a post-World War II country was ready to give them this kind of power. Watch the next steps. A small cohort in the Pentagon knew what had actually happened. The same act also birthed the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. If there was ever a perfect time to entrench clandestine authority tasked with managing the secret, this was the moment. So here we had a secret structure that was built. When we're looking at that, the entire piece, if they had not done it this way, you'd have a totally different development in government. Government would have been much more open. And they had the excuse of the Cold War because they had a nuclear enemy. I mean, we have a nuclear enemy around the world now as well. But here's what we need to kind of understand in relation to how they got this through. It really had to do with after we dropped the bomb, the whole thing was on so that nobody would get the bomb but us. And of course, that was all given up in 1949 with Russian spies and all the rest. They got their own bomb, exploded it, and off to the races. Everybody that technology went around the world. So, but they used that excuse of hiding nuclear material what they were actually hiding, certainly they were hiding nuclear material, but the idea that they were hiding the UFO file goes a long way, especially when physicist Robert Sarbarker said, hey, you know what happened? These guys basically created something that was above any kind of level. It was far above the level of the atomic bomb secrecy. Quite remarkable. That is the 509th group and the X-steganography embodied in it to discover the Roswell case, and that's the same one that General Van Herk comes out of. Whenever you see that kind of X-steganography deep coming through, then you have to pay close attention. All right, this is actually going to bring us back to Kenneth Arnold. Here's something when I said Kenneth Arnold's story is a murder mystery. Let's start with this. There's so many deaths and unusual incidents around Kenneth Arnold's sighting, but his own death would have been in the cards had he not been such an excellent pilot. Because here he is now, he's had a second sighting, and it's late in July, and it's the same craft. You never hear about this one. You always hear, oh, he saw this one craft, and, you know, he was off to the races, these 9 UFOs up in the mountain. And often they don't even emphasize that it was 9. But that's June 24th. End of July, he sees the 9 craft, the exact same swarm of craft again. And he's flying in the same area. So what he does is he goes to report this. He lands in Pendleton, Oregon. And the boys there gassed up my airplane. I got out of the cockpit and strayed from my plane. I signed my credit slip and with a full gas tank was ready to take off again for home. I wasn't tarrying and the hours of daylight were numbered. I had navigation lights, but I didn't have a battery in my ship to operate them. So I had to make it home before dark. I recall flipping my controls to indicate to the tower operator I was going to take off. The tower operator knew me, and I knew I had a receiver. He always came over the receiver to me, and if for some reason I should hold, everything seemed fine. My plane was running well. Again, I shoved the throttle clear to a stop. My engine roared, and I was off the ground. I reached an altitude which I would judge was around 50 feet. My engine stopped cold.
Wow.
Again, I shoved the throttle clear to stop. I would judge I was around 50 feet. My engine stopped cold. It was as if every piston had frozen solid. It never even gave a dying bark. To take off and have an engine stop at that low altitude is probably the most dangerous thing that can happen in an airplane. You don't have enough speed to sustain you for a normal landing with most craft. Your only choice for putting her down is straight ahead with no power and little or no lift from the surface of your wings. Instinctively, I dove the plane straight to the ground until I must have been within 10 feet of the runway. Then came back on the stick as fast as I dared in an attempt to level off without causing an abrupt stall. My little airplane came through. I was sinking fast, but I set it down on all 3 points. The shock was pretty hard. My left landing gear was badly bent, and my left spar was broken in 2. At the moment, I didn't know what had happened. I thought the engine had frozen. I was unhurt. I jumped out of the cockpit, ran to the front of the plane, and turned the propeller. It was loose and easy. People came running out to see what was the matter. I was curious to see if the engine would start again. I scooted around the wing, back into the cockpit. There I discovered what had caused my engine to stop. Until this is written, I have kept this a secret to myself. My fuel valve was shut off. I knew instantly that there was only one person who could have shut the fuel valve off, and that was myself. I turned the valve back on. One of the fellows swung the propeller. My engine started immediately and ran smoothly. I taxied my plane rather limpingly into the hangar. I was scared straight. I didn't tell anyone what had happened for the simple reason no one would believe me. The realization that my thought or mind in some peculiar way was being controlled or dictated to, or it could have caused this to happen, would seem perfectly preposterous to anyone who had not experienced what I had experienced. Okay, so Arnold goes through this incident. He gets worldwide attention, and he gets interest from the CIA and all these other people. Or the military intelligence group that was forming into the CIA. Then he investigates the Maury Island case, which I'm going to get into here. And the Maury Island case is very unusual because the players that are involved also show up in various deep state events going forward for the next 2 or 3 decades. But it's also an interesting case because it may be the exact same craft that are being seen that he saw. And then at the end of July, he has a sighting again. So he's going back during that sighting. He's going back to interview Harold Dahl and the other people involved with the Maury Island case. And now his plane is being tampered with. And in this case, he's saying they used a kind of mind control on him to make him do it himself because no one else could have done it. That's a lot richer story than just the thing that they roll out about Kenneth Arnold every year. But there are other deaths involved in the Kenneth Arnold story as well. And one of them are very, very strange. So the short thumbnail of the Maury Island case is that a group that recovers lumber that gets lost in these different rivers and streams. This guy who ran the boat, Harold Dahl, and his son and his dog are on there, and they see these craft come in. And I will read his exact statement, but what I want to basically give us an outline of it. And what happens is it looks like one of the craft is in trouble, and it shoots something off to the boat, which burns the boat, kills the dog, and hurts the arm of his son. So he reports this, and the person who owns the boat is Fred Chrisman, who is a very unusual former OSS, deep military guy. And
former?
What's that?
Former?
Is there
such
time,
a thing?
Yeah, right. At the time, former. Well, he has such a deep background on this, and he's going to be involved not only around the UFO file, but around assassination, including some of the most famous of all. But what's interesting about Chrisman is he's reluctant to take Dahl's story seriously. And the story comes to the attention of a magazine editor who is reading all these other stories about Kenneth Arnold and says, I want to hire you to go there and talk to these guys to see if it was the same thing, etc. And so he goes and he interviews Dahl. And what happens is they give him some of the slag. But as soon as he gets there, a number of weird things start to take place, including the fact that when he arrives and calls the hotel, he finds out his room has already been picked out for him. And they say, oh, yeah, like, we're ready for you. Your room is ready, Kenneth Arnold. That's weird to start with, but he goes along with it anyway. The next thing is he starts getting calls which are telling him all the movements that he made. For example, you just went into the lobby, you just got a drink here, you picked up a paper, you came back upstairs. They're just recounting these things to him on the phone, trying to tell him, basically, you're under constant surveillance. So instantly, there's an ex-protect type group interfering with his investigation of the Maury Island case, which, remember, is before Roswell and before his own sighting, even though he's investigating it later. So in the middle of all this, Dahl starts to get these visits from these men in black who describe to him what took place for him when he was on the boat and everything that he did for that day. And they invite him to breakfast under the guise of, we want to buy your boat, and you have such great business, and we do lumber and all the rest. So they freak him out. And he goes and talks with Arnold, and he brings some of the slag. And Arnold gets freaked out by the conversations that he's hearing and by the people who are bugging him. And what he does is he calls in military intelligence. And they send in these pilots who investigate with him this slag that comes from the case. And it's supposedly something that came directly off one of the UFOs onto the boat. And so when they bring him in this box, this slag, the pilots take it. And then the pilots, he's hanging out with them and he's like, hey, you guys, this is great. I'll go with you tomorrow. We could do all this stuff. I'll give you testimony. They're like, no, we have to take off now. And he's like, their whole manner changed and they got what they came for, basically. And so what happens to that plane is it blows up. Now, what's interesting is, and it's carrying the slag, and everyone has always surmised, oh, it was carrying the slag, and that's what happened. Somebody, basically the slag made it take fire, or they exploded the plane, whatever it happens to be. Now, here's what's interesting to me, where I think the whole story of Kenneth Arnold comes into, like, we start to understand that from the very start of his work, the X-Protect group is interfering with his activity. There's a plane pilot who hears that there's a flight that's about to take off, and it's the flight that has the slag on it. And he says, oh, you know, one of the things I noticed is that they were guarding it with machine guns. That was odd right away. Then the next thing is he had a certain type of pass that allowed him to get on any military transport plane. And so they allowed him to get on the plane. Now, this guy tells the story that they learned that there was a fire on the wing, and that instantly the two men who die, who were the two people who came to get the slag, they come and they're talking to him and they say, you know what, jump out. Here's your parachute, jump out. And they force him out and he jumps out, and the plane is going down, and he watches the plane go down, and he says there's about 10 minutes for them to jump out. So it doesn't make any sense to him that they had him out and jumping on a parachute, but these guys never get out. So there's something weird about that story too, about those people dying, because they got this other guy out in a parachute and they had the slag with them. And the story of that plane is this incredible disaster where it goes down, and the two people who came to meet Arnold in this hotel room to review the slag that Harold Dahl had given him die in this plane crash, along with the slag, which gets burnt up. So now you have two deaths there, and they had almost killed Arnold himself. So Arnold's getting freaked out, and he tells the magazine editor, I don't want any part of this, just forget about my investigation. And the magazine editor says, you should really get out of there. And so what happens then is that he meets with Dahl, who is freaked out, and Dahl apparently will have more Men in Black visits, and they will say, if you care about your family, you won't talk about this subject anymore. And what they do is they kidnap his son, and the son is 15 years old. And long story short, the son ends up being found 3 months later in Utah, working in a restaurant doing dishes, and has no memory of what took place in between. And as a result of getting the son back, Dahl signs a thing confessing that the whole thing was a hoax, and the Maury Island case, forget it, I never saw these UFOs, and all the rest of it. So this is how the X-Protect group gets the entire thing dropped. And so everybody looks like a hoaxer involved. But Arnold, who was an honest, straight up person, knows the real story from going in there and investigating. And so he becomes kind of a target for a long time, which is why this incident happens, where they try to bump him off by shutting off his engine. So instantly around this case is a series of that lethal X-Protect aspect, hiding the transparency, coming forward about what was going on. Now, what's weird is that in that period, there's something remarkable taking place. There's the Kenneth Arnold sighting, there's Maury Island, there's Roswell, but there's a whole slew of cases in that period. There's a wave. So something is taking place, which is basically not only just causing regular people to get involved, but governments having to really clamp down and setting up all kinds of trapdoors for the witnesses who are coming forward and really steering this story. So, and we're in that nuclear era, and we're the ones who have the atomic bomb and the other countries don't. So, there's also that to contend with. And we've also set off nuclear weapons. And is this the big flash that got all these UFOs involved with us? It's unusual because, again, this wave takes place in 1947, which is 2 years after we dropped the bomb. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight on Kenneth Arnold and the 75th anniversary of his sighting. Just remarkable. When we get into the details, we're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I've got more to get to on Kenneth Arnold, but before we do, Miss Olivia.
Mind Control Inc. DJ, what was Arnold's CIA connection?
Well, the CIA hadn't been consolidated into an actual agency when he had his sighting. So you're dealing with military intelligence, leftovers of OSS, etc. But when they make the Central Intelligence Agency, when it becomes this full-on clandestine agency in September with the National Security Act, the creation of that whole consolidation, that is part of the repercussions of this incredible UFO wave. They were planning it for sure, but this seems to be something where they said, you know, we really need this authority in order to be able to hide the UFO file because the X technology is inside of it. This is where, when we look at these things, we need to get our minds wrapped around what X technology is versus the UFO file technology. And the thing is that the X technology resides inside of it. Think of it that way. So the UFO file contains things directly from recovered craft, all the cases and all the things that are related to what took place. But once they deem it security matter X, that gives them the ability to run the entire secret technology program through the UFO file. So the X file is the UFO file. What's interesting is that the technology, however, doesn't have to be some alien technology. This is the fascinating part, because that X technology, if you look through the eyes of X steganography, and you can see part of this in Walter Bosley's work on NIMSA and the Delshow X steganography that's deep in that work, that airship technology that was available in the 19th century, the mystery school technology that was hidden from Keeley's work, which was actually shipped directly out of Boston over to the Theosophical Society and Annie Besant, they knew what was taking place, and they were going into this whole thing about, you know, well, we're going to roll up to World War I, and if people have this advanced technology, they're going to bomb each other out of oblivion. So the mystery schools hide some of what Keeley was doing, but then there's Tesla's work that's out there. And what happens is Tesla's work gets knocked down and thrown out of circulation by corporate factors who are like, this guy wants to, you know, beam free energy around the world the way he can beam wireless communications. Like, he's dangerous, you know. In 10 years, we'll be out of the picture and the culture will move forward. Forget about that. So all that X technology resides in the UFO file. That's why when we look at it and we think the UFO file, we shouldn't just think aliens. We should think extremely advanced technology and exotic technology, and also what on this show we call apotheum, which you could say is a word I made up. It does actually appear at times in history, but it's my term for this type of physics that is mutates physical manifestation. So whenever you get around those cases and you see, you know, well, somebody had a UFO sighting and then all of a sudden they were walking through windows and getting abducted and floated up, and their car is floating up, you know, all of these things that upset the laws of physics are all apotheum effects. Exactly when you say, oh, there was a large craft, it was sitting on the ground and nothing will grow there. And you go back to some of these major sightings from the 60s and 70s and go back to where this craft supposedly landed and nothing still grows there. So those are apotheum effects, and it's a whatever that mix of energy is in that physics, when it comes into combination with our own physics, it creates things that don't ascribe to physical law. And so that's the thing in the UFO file that they're the most afraid of, and why they block it with such a level of secrecy, because they can't control the apotheum. The apotheum is the same factor that the mystery schools kept about the destruction of Atlantis. It is a complete world-changing impact effect. And so when we think about the UFO file, I think that's a good place for us to go. Did you have a follow-up? Go ahead.
I do indeed. Okay, one, Thermobstrafel says Dahl's father-in-law ran Camp X.
Oh, yes, he did. He did have that connection. And Camp X is, of course, let's just say it was training of spies in Canada. How's that? There's all sorts of interesting connections. Of course, I've gotten into some of them, and I got to get into some of them in the documentary that I did, which is UFO File Assassins X-Protect. That's from like a year and a half ago now, but it's still it still carries a punch. And believe me, there's a good follow-up coming. But here's the interesting thing that I want to take from this. the person who created Security Matter X, let me see if I can consolidate all these different pieces. And I want to remind you, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 128, deep on Kenneth Arnold, 75-year anniversary of the CIA COG UFO deception. And that doesn't mean that UFOs don't exist. Of course they do, in fact. But the explanations we've been given and the obfuscation that's been involved comes directly from that corridor of the intelligence agencies and the aerospace companies. And they are building a massive, and I mean massive, underground presence. And that's all connected up with the continuity of government program. And that is, it's something they've already activated. So it's not even such a wild conspiracy for me to say, well, they plan to rule by continuity of government. In fact, they activated it during 9/11, and they haven't let up since. All right, here's a couple of things. Right after the Kenneth Arnold sighting, this gets photographed over Phoenix. Remember the Phoenix lights now? But there's the craft in the weird back of the craft that he said that the other ones that weren't the crescent-shaped ones had. The person who shot this was into photography. And so they were able, when they saw the thing, to get up there and get a shot real fast. We don't have a lot of good UFO photos from 1947, in fact. Here's another shot of it to get a real feel for that back. So this description now of these craft sounds exactly like what he saw. And then remember, in late July of 1947, he sees them again. So something is going on there. And then we have the Roswell crash. And, in the Maury Island case where they're hovering off Washington. So between Washington, Arizona, and New Mexico, there's something massive taking place. It starts in that northwest corridor of Washington, Oregon, and then moves down. So I believe we're looking at exactly the same piece, in fact. All right. Here's what Hynek had to say in relation to how the intelligence community was handling the UFO file. And remember, Heineken was part of their program with Blue Book, and then he got out and was like, I want to tell the truth. And he was part of the Close Encounters of the Third Kind and all the rest. And he said the Robertson panel, which the CIA created in 1952 to whitewash the UFO file, made the subject of UFOs scientifically unrespectable. This is crucial. And for nearly 20 years, not enough attention was paid to the subject to acquire the kind of data needed even to decide the nature of the UFO phenomenon. What they did is they removed it from the public spectrum. And people had science fiction movies and they had, phony whitewash stories of Project Blue Book, so they never got anywhere. So we as a culture got arrested in development around this because here's Kenneth Arnold saying, I've seen these craft which represent something else besides us or the Russians. Therefore, it's another civilization here or from out there. Or somebody has advanced technology on this planet and we don't know anything about it. But that whole line of thought, the whole thing gets cut off. And there are people who come forward, like Donald Kehoe, who's a pilot, who used to fly with Lindbergh, who was very aware of the UFO file. And he becomes the real big pain for the Air Force by saying, we have all these pilots who've seen all these craft. What are they? And he starts all those groups that you hear about later, like NICAP and all the rest of it. But for me, that's an incredible shift that takes place, which is they start to just work with that UFO file and keep it under wraps. And then they have a protection unit that says nobody's going to get near this stuff, including the President of the United States. I'm going to get to that in a minute. This was a short article that came out, I think in 1977, and it's from a local Idaho newspaper. And this is a few things. I've seen some interviews with Arnold late in that 70s period, and he seems kind of bitter about everything that's taken place because it kind of ruined his life in many ways, as much as it made him a celebrity. I have, of course, suffered some embarrassment here and there by misquotes and misinformation, Kenneth Arnold was saying about the famous incident. I'll tell you, sometimes I think that an editor of a newspaper says to the newsman, now look it, I want you to write a story about these flying saucers and make this goofy bastard look silly. That's how they ran it. And that's how really it was up until very recently. And the reason for the turn isn't that they are some great transparent body. It's that they want to use the threat now. They're ready. They're in position, which is a dangerous place for us to get to. One other thing about this with Arnold that I found really fascinating. I also want to say that Arnold is from Idaho and Hemingway is from Ketchum, Idaho. And in there's a very interesting body of land that gets my attention. So I'm going to get into that too. Here's directly from the New York Times, a couple of quick things. Arnold reported seeing near Mount Rainier 9 circular type objects flying in formation more than twice the speed of sound. His was the first widely reported UFO sighting in this country and set off a wave of other reported sightings. Arnold would pay the price for describing something so fantastic. In a now declassified document, the Air Force Material Command wrote it off. The report cannot even bear superficial examination, therefore must be disregarded. The official line, they had to get it out. They had to get this out of the system completely. For Arnold, it stung. He didn't consider himself a kook. He had 4,000 hours of mountain high altitude pilot time. He was in the Idaho search and rescue. I've been subjected to ridicule, much loss of time and money, newspaper notoriety, magazine stories, reflections on my honesty, my character, my business dealings, Arnold wrote. He died in 1984 at the age of 68. In all those years, he never wavered in his descriptions. That's crucial. Quote, I made my report because I thought it was my duty. It was the only proper and American thing to do. I saw what I saw. So it's interesting. Arnold was an unlikely candidate to become embroiled in such a controversy. He lived in Meridian, Idaho, and sold fire extinguishing equipment. About as unusual as his life got was he piloted a small airplane to get his clients around the Northwest. A month after Arnold was in the news, a now declassified report made in July of 1947 by Army Air Force Counterintelligence Corps officer Frank Brown said, Mr. Arnold is a man of 32 years age, being married and the father of 2 children. It is the personal opinion of the interviewer that Mr. Arnold actually saw what he saw. To go further, if Mr. Arnold can write a report of the character that he did while not having seen the objects that he claimed he saw, it's the opinion of the interviewer that Mr. Arnold is in the wrong business. He should be writing Buck Rogers fiction. This is how convincing Arnold was. And he had the facts. What he saw originally was a bright flash. Remember, it's a daytime sighting, blue skies, and then 9 craft and 1 crescent-shaped craft going 1,700 miles an hour. So that takes us into the story of him getting enlisted to investigate the Maury Island case. I gave you the outline of the case. Here's what I want to point out. Harold Dahl eventually recanted his confession. Dahl basically disappears off the map. Crispin, who comes in and is working the story with Arnold, and is also Arnold just getting suspicious of because he's caught him in a few lies. Like, how did you get in touch with this magazine editor? And he says, oh, I've been reading his thing since I was in the war or whatever. And the guy only started publishing the magazine the year before. So there's a lot of weird things that take place there. And Arnold stops trusting Crispin. Crispin becomes such an interesting character in all this because he's the one he runs into Arnold's hotel and says, oh my goodness, the 2 pilots, they blew up their car, their plane is blown up. Now it's interesting to me because he starts to not trust him. And what he learns 2 days later is that Crispin takes a plane to Alaska. And what's interesting about this is he's on Air Force, he's in reserves for the Army. He no longer is active, but that is a military plane that takes him to Alaska. So basically, he was in the middle of this whole thing. The two pilots go down. He kind of controls the entire situation, and then he's gone to Alaska. So Arnold can't get at him. Dahl has disappeared. The entire Maury Island case dissolves, and they almost kill Arnold in the middle of it. So really dealing with quite a different thing. When you think about Kenneth Arnold, you always think, oh, it's the first flying saucer sighting. Well, this guy got instantly involved with that deep state level. Now, what's interesting is our friend Chrisman reemerges. And he reemerges in Jim Garrison's investigation of the JFK assassination. Why does he reemerge?
Okay, can you hold that for a second?
Yes.
Okay, before we move into JFK, or because you're moving to JFK, David Termini said, DJ, during the JFK Jr. plane crash investigation, it was speculated that one possible explanation for how his plane went down sounds exactly like the Kenneth Arnold fuel valve.
Isn't that
story.
interesting? Wow, absolutely fascinating. I will go on record saying that the JFK Jr. plane crash is one of the most suspicious things on record. And if it was well known the stuff that he was working on at the time, it would make a lot more sense. And I think it's part of why the disinformation grind around JFK Jr. being alive and all that stuff got out there and got going, because they don't want anyone to ever take that case seriously. So now when you say JFK Jr., they have it, right? They've created the Q buzz system inside the media. Now they have the JFK Jr. thing. So it's an untouchable. Anytime you get around an untouchable, watch out. You're deep in the weeds. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew.
Actually, you're right. They create a third rail.
Yes. No question about it.
So you just avoid it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. I mean, COVID itself, they did the same thing with. And they did it at the beginning of the Ukraine thing. If you said anything other than the official story, watch out. September 11th was exactly like that. The terrorists, the threat levels and all the rest. And we just kind of live under it, because in an ordinary situation, you would expect the truth from the government. We haven't got the truth from the government in so long. This has been going on a long time, but the more that divide grows, the more unusual and schizophrenic the situation on the ground grows, so that we become ungovernable on one hand, and on their side, they become untrustworthy. So there's a legacy and a cycle of disrespect, and we're right in the middle of it, in the heart of it. JFK assassination, what's interesting when you really get to it, is that it's, every time you get around investigating it, you run smack into the UFO file, if you do any kind of real research. And what they'll do traditionally, they'll say, well, some people thought that Cubans or mafia were involved, but the official story is Lee Harvey Oswald, which is ridiculous. And Oswald, anyone who is a reasonable person researching the JFK assassination would have to go to the fact that Oswald worked for Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister's in the middle of the Maury Island story too, because Guy Bannister investigated all those cases for the UFO file. He created the X-Files by creating Security Matter X as a designation. And for years, that was denied. And now it's coming out more and more, this SMX piece, which is the X part was created by Bannister. So Oswald worked for Bannister. There's no denying it. The secretaries who worked for Bannister did it, and the posters that Oswald put out there for his anti-Castro or pro-Castro leaflets and stuff, pretending he's a communist and all that, all have Bannister's address on them. So we know that he worked for Bannister in the summer in New Orleans before the assassination. So here we have Bannister, the ultimate right-winger, who has this big UFO background. And remember, he used to be the FBI chief in Chicago. And he is investigating UFO cases in 1947, 1948, when the waves happened. So he's in that whole Kenneth Arnold period. And he creates, well, these are pretty weird cases. I'm going to call them Security Matter X, because it relates directly to the X technology. That's where the whole X-Files thing comes from. And when they did the show and the series, the reason everybody knows the X-Files and all the rest, it's because the FBI had a real series of files called the X-Files related directly to the X technology around the UFO file. That part is so important in all this, because when you get around the assassination of President Kennedy, you know, I've put things on the record that connected it with the UFO file through the Watergate confessions and the things that Hunt told Caddy. But what's fascinating is Garrison runs into aerospace over and over again when he's investigating the Kennedy assassination. And he himself doesn't understand it. But what he figures out at a certain point is that Chrisman works for Boeing, and that they had a group that he called Boeing Assassins. And he feels that Chrisman is a hired gun by Boeing in this aerospace corridor of the intelligence crowd, that he is one of the shooters involved in Dealey Plaza. So we go from 1947 with Maury Island and this guy Chrisman spinning the wheels of Kenneth Arnold and then disappearing to Alaska, showing up 20 years later in the JFK assassination investigation of Guy Bannister's death and Jim Garrison's case. But why? Again, I'm going to go back to this question. Why did Garrison think that about Chrisman? Because he found out that the person that he charged with the case, Clay Shaw, that the first phone call he made when he got grabbed by police was to Chrisman. Now think about that. Chrisman is supposed to be sort of like, you know, this casual character in history, whatever, he was involved with the UFO sighting. The person who gets nabbed, the only person who's actually charged with the crime of assassinating President Kennedy, calls Fred Chrisman as his one phone call when he gets grabbed by police. So think of the level that Chrisman is on. And what's funny is when he gets questioned, and Garrison's questioning him on the stand about his relationship to Shaw and his relationship to aerospace and all the rest. And at a certain point, Garrison says the name of a person, Mr. Roswell. Are you familiar with Mr. Roswell? And and then we have Chrisman going through this whole thing saying, yes, I know Mr. Roswell, you know. So what I'm thinking when I look at that exchange, there may very well have been a person named Roswell, but think about the steganography of Garrison pressing this guy who's involved in the UFO file and the JFK assassination, asking if he's ever talked to Mr. Roswell.
I've never heard of anyone named Mr. Roswell. I've never seen it on any movie, like IMDb's or anything.
Yeah, it's pretty unusual. What I would say when we look at this and we get a perspective on it, here's a couple of things to take to the bank that Garrison brought through related directly to the UFO file aspect of the JFK assassination, which is what he brought through, which is crucial, is that Oswald, when he was leaving Riley Coffee Company, which is where he was working as a sort of front job in New Orleans, and Riley was involved with all kinds of weird shipping arms and things like that, even though they were a coffee company. There were rumors that the way they got all kinds of arms into Cuba was that they sent it there as coffee. Somebody opens up the big coffee jar and there's a machine gun in there. So what we look at, and I think where we're going with all of this is Oswald says, I'm going to NASA. I'm going to work for NASA. So that's why I'm leaving. So everyone there thinks he's going to work for NASA. When he goes to interview the different people who work with Oswald, he finds out that 98% of them, with the exception of like one or two people, the people who left after Oswald left, all the people he worked with, all went to work either for NASA or other aerospace companies. So whatever was going on there, whatever was being set up in New Orleans previous to the Kennedy assassination in Dallas, in that summer, what was happening was directly related to NASA and the aerospace company. So Garrison, with this information, goes to a newspaper editor, and he says, you know, you have to do all this stuff. I need to talk to you. I'm going to call you in the mailroom. And he has this guy running around. And the magazine is Ramparts Magazine. And he gets him on the phone and he says, you know, forget about everything we know about the JFK assassination. I found out it's limited to the intelligence wing of the aerospace wing of the military intelligence industrial complex. So he found it there. And then he lists off the companies that are involved, and Lockheed Martin and Boeing are the ones that he puts on the record. And he says, I have to tell you this in case things aren't safe for me going forward. So what he discovered and what he was able to bring forward in the case, you know, he has a case against the Central Intelligence Agency assassinating President Kennedy. He's able to get that part out, and he gets destroyed in the media. And of course, you know, he gets his due when Oliver Stone makes the movie. But there's nothing in the movie about aerospace or the UFO file. Just, you know, they weren't able to tackle that aspect of it. And I've put this on the record before in relation to the deep state. Researchers and those people, they don't want to deal with the UFO file. And I don't blame them, because the UFO researchers don't live up to the kind of clout that people have doing that level of research. And the UFO field lends itself to this thing. One advantage that the UFO field has is that it will deal with the UFO aspect. But now so much of that field has fallen over to the Central Intelligence UFO threat narrative that where are we now? 75 years after the creation of the National Security Act, the Kenneth Arnold sightings, the Roswell case, we're under the thumb of the Central Intelligence Agency regarding the UFO file, even after all those people have had those abduction experiences, even after all the sightings, even after the intergenerational trading of stories and personal histories and things. Where we are with it publicly is it's been thrown into the Department of Homeland Security and the CIA so that they can run a continuity of government operation based on a UFO threat emergency. That is a pretty dismal spiral from where this research started. And so we need to deconstruct those pieces and how it happens. I have more to do that with, but Miss Olivia, you've been waiting long enough.
Okay.
Your questions are up.
David Tormina again. DJ, do you suspect the Cosmos Club was working alongside the Caroline Group?
Yeah, this is important because the Caroline Group relates directly to the people that they were recruiting out of the T.T. Brown aspect of working with the deep technology in the hot zone. And the people around the Caroline Group, Thomas Townsend Brown, Ernest Hemingway, in my opinion, John F. Kennedy. And the group, again, remember that name is just the name of a yacht. And so they referred to it because T.T. Brown's daughter, you know, just kind of threw that out there. We don't know what the actual name of the intelligence unit was, but that group was working with, one, the secret around the hot zone in Cuba, and two, this advanced technology that they were working with around the UFO file. Those two pieces are absolutely crucial to understand that group. When you get to the Cosmos Club, you get a place very much like the Bilderberg Group where these people can go and set up conversations on a deep level and make it as part of a public thing. So on one night, you know, they go there and they talk about the stars and astronomy, and someone gives an astronomy lecture. But the next night, they all go out together there inside that environment, and they can hash out for a day or two the things that they've been moving on the UFO file. It's very much like the Bilderberg Group with agendas and all the rest of it, but the cover is splendid. And of course, John F. Kennedy was a member of the Cosmos Club, but resigned. And so when we start to really look at it, the people that really got my attention around the Cosmos Club was really basically because I was starting to see the advanced level of people who were involved on the UFO side. So the same guy who took pictures of the Cuban Missile Crisis and had, you know, was taking pictures of the missiles on the ground there in Cuba, he was the same guy who was analyzing the UFO photos because he was such a photo expert. And he was a member of that Cosmos Club. And that opened up a lot of different doors, but also some of the real arc skeptics publicly who we know lived a double life. They were over here at Harvard as part of the Harvard astronomy group, and they were researching UFOs. But publicly, they were saying this stuff could never exist. Donald Menzel, for example, and Stanton Friedman did the research. And he went and he spent the time with it. He found him right in the heart of sending letters to Kennedy, being like, "I can be helpful to you on this UFO subject. Give me a ring." But publicly, this guy was 100% against it. And if you look in the documents, and there's some levels of documents that are on the magic side that are legit, and others that are just, made up. But the ones that have Menzel in there, it's very interesting because his appearance and his living a double life, working directly on the UFO file while publicly debunking it, is a crucial identifying factor for what they have in various experts that have come out before. The same people who are working on this stuff are the mouthpieces that they put forward debunking it. They don't do the debunk action anymore. Now they want it. Now they want to bring it on because they have some level of UFO threat they want to bring us into. Yes.
Wendy Eater. Does DJ believe a deal was struck between the USA government and aliens for technology as rumored? And James Clements is asking, highly advanced aliens wouldn't take over the Earth with attacks and explosions. They would slowly breed themselves into the native species until they become you. You are that project unfolding.
Oh, that's real good. Well, look, here's the way I look at it. I honestly don't feel that there's any kind of UFO takeover thing. So I think the UFO threat is largely made up. I think there's a scientific observation program. And I also feel that, if you go into timeline activity, and if you look at the level of how we could get ourselves into a situation where, just think of these transhumanists in one generation, what they could do. They could turn us into an unrecognizable species if we went along with them. And the vast majority of us need to be convinced not to. And many of us never, ever, ever would. But nonetheless, what would they do? Literally, in a couple generations, they would have, they're already growing, their own versions and test tubes and things. They have their own clone program. I mean, they really, when we think about just what the public discussions are, should there be cloning and all this stuff? They've been doing it since, technically since the late 70s. So if we go further back, they probably had a program for that type of advanced cloning that came out of the German program. So, these are the types of questions. It gets pretty deep there. But whenever we talk about technology, it's one aspect. Because instantly when you talk about technology, you're talking about science, which leads you to medical pieces, and then breeding becomes a big part of that. Did they make a deal with aliens? There's enough interesting things on the record, in my opinion, including Eisenhower meeting with an alien group, which even Stanton Friedman, who was a real hard-nosed guy when it came to the UFO file and what was real and what wasn't, he told me that he felt that the story of Eisenhower meeting with aliens had a very solid foundation, and that they came literally to say to him, look, we think you're going to blow things up. We're happy to share, our philosophy with you so that you don't set off nuclear attack, destroying civilization. And that Eisenhower, with the advice of his group, said, can you give us technology? And they said, well, you're not ready for that, but we can give you levels of understanding. And he said, no, it would be too upsetting to the culture to know of your presence religious wise. And if you don't have any technology for us, we don't want to deal with it. So that's the thrust of it. We don't know. And, they said that there's treaties and things like that. There's some level of contact for sure that has taken place over time. I don't know how consistent the contact is. Then you have other stories about underground bases where aliens are working and things like that. You can't discount it because of how the level of secrecy is. This is why secrecy is so corrosive, because it leaves us in a zone where we need to kind of, understand things without direct experience. But here's one thing I think we can take to the bank on all this, which is there's something about us subconsciously, and this is where the Edgar Cayce readings come in so crucially. Sometime in an Edgar Cayce reading, they asked him, where are you getting this information to give, a diagnosis for this patient, for example, who's in Oakland while you're sitting here in Virginia Beach? And he said, the subconscious mind of the person asking for the information. So on some level, subconsciously, we're all connected. So therefore, the people who are working on the alien part and think it's all secret and all the rest of it, it's not, because we have some connection to their subconscious mind. So therefore, on some level, we know what they know. Yeah. What do you got?
Rosterman the Seer is desperate for me to ask this question. Is there a list? In exchange for technology, Eisenhower allegedly agreed to allow some people to be taken for study as long as they disclose the names. Can that list of names be found somewhere if somebody suspects that their name's on the list?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is interesting. Very interesting. I had a conversation. I've talked about this group before named the Transcenders, who, before I was even doing dark journalism, this thing came up about their October 13th prediction was made by a NORAD officer. And long story short, I got a press release when I was working at a tech magazine for it, and I got in touch, and I wasn't able to have that conversation I wanted to have because the guy was busy doing like coast to coast and all this stuff. But we were going to talk about his prediction, because on October 13th, 2010, all of these craft were seen over New York City. Now, you notice it's pretty interesting. You never hear about this in UFO circles. You never hear about it with the CIA dog whistle show of Elizondo and all those people. Nobody ever mentions this case. This is a very crucial and important case. October 13th, 2010, during the day in Soho, craft hovered over the city of New York City. And this is, off the charts. And I remember when it was predicted, I can go on record saying that the guy predicted it because I got one of the press releases in September, maybe the 23rd of September, and the incident happened October 13th. So the prediction was out there. And that UFO sighting took place. And I did an episode on it last fall. It's Stan Fulham and the Transcenders. But anyway, around this, the Transcenders said something very interesting. They said that there was a deal made by the government of the Eisenhower administration and the aliens, and that they said, yes, you can abduct some people and do tests on them, but we want a list of those people. And that after a while, the Greys, who got belligerent with our government from doing this, eventually started doing it, and that they couldn't track them, and that they didn't give them lists of names or tell them who they were abducting. And that became kind of an animosity situation. One of the other things that is interesting that the Transcenders told me in relation to this, for what it's worth, it was channeled information, but they said that the alien aspect that was involved, the Pleiadian group that was meant to sort of help move the culture forward, was being shot at by our government, and that we had a hostile program versus them, but a partial acceptance of the Greys who were more technology friendly, shall we say, but who had their belligerent side. So it's not an easy relationship, whatever it is. And again, that could all be not true. What we do know solidly is that the same group that operated with extreme secrecy around the UFO file based on these sightings is the same group that's coming out now and touting the UFO threat. So the X-Protect group that destroyed reputations, and in some cases through lethal force, in my opinion, through the testimony of E. Howard Hunt and others, that the UFO file was the reason behind the Kennedy assassination. I think X-Protect, that's their, that's the central piece of what they did to prevent the UFO file information from coming out, is eliminate President Kennedy. There are other reasons the Central Intelligence Agency and X-Protect were involved in eliminating President Kennedy. But that seems to be really the core piece if you go deep enough into it. And what's interesting is you can see that group lined up during the Rosenberg trials. The same people are involved. That's pretty interesting. So it's a deep state entrenched power. There's one other thing I wanted to say about Watergate, and I didn't do the 50th anniversary of Watergate, but I want to work it in here. Something came out that was on there was a tape that came out for the 50th anniversary, and Jefferson Morley, who's done some interesting work on the JFK assassination, he was the Washington Post reporter who they didn't want going into that. So he left like 15 years ago, and he does a number of different things. But he's in a case with the Central Intelligence Agency to get all the files around George Joannidis, who was, it turned out, the person who created the whole Oswald project. But I know that he worked with Bobby Inman, who was the only CIA person who ever came out on the record before this recent group, and said, oh yeah, we know who's inside the craft. There's a UFO file and all this stuff. So Joannidis, who was in charge of the JFK assassination patsy, is getting his Lifetime Achievement Award by the guy who spoke publicly for the UFO file on the CIA side. That's a weird little combination. But what happened was these tapes came out, and I recommend that people get a hold of this. This is Nixon talking to Richard Helms. And Richard Helms was a CIA director who, under the Nixon administration, who was the kind of assistant director under Dulles and during the Kennedy administration. And Nixon knew that he was involved in the JFK assassination. He's sitting down and he says, look, I want basically all the JFK assassination files. It's the only way I can protect you. And instantly, Richard Helms realizes he's being set up or whatever, and that there's a taping system going. So he doesn't say anything. But Nixon keeps going. He goes, look, when these things come up about who shot John, I want to make sure that the CIA looks clean. And I've always lied for you guys before, and I lied for you during the dirty tricks thing. This is on record now. This is very important, and it's one of those things, again, with the anniversaries, I think we have the opportunity to elevate the conversation. Nixon is there basically blackmailing the CIA director because he knows that they were involved in the Kennedy assassination. And he's saying, I need those files, and I need you to give them and share them with me, even though they're CIA files and I'm the president. I need you to give me that stuff because it's my only way to protect you, because you're going to get it, basically, because they're going to open up this whole who shot John thing. It's clear as a bell. That's what's taking place there. And what's interesting is it would come out through Robert Merritt, who I interviewed on this program, and Douglas Caddy, that one of the main reasons they were going in to the Watergate apartment complex to go to the DNC was because someone who had worked, Larry O'Brien, who'd worked for Howard Hughes, they had been convinced that Larry O'Brien had the information about the Central Intelligence Agency being involved in the assassination, and that it was under Vice President Nixon that the group that carried out the assassination was created, and that those files were in the safe at Watergate, and that is what Watergate was all about, directly related to the JFK assassination. That makes sense. And the Hughes connection with it as well, because if you go deep enough into that case, and I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but the same Watergate burglars were involved with burglarizing this safe a month earlier of the publisher of the Las Vegas Sun. And they were leapfrogging, looking for this thing that was moving around. And again, the Las Vegas Sun was originally owned by Howard Hughes, and the Hughes aspect there around Watergate is crucial. And that rumor that was spread that those files are in there at the DNC made Nixon paranoid enough to go in there, or wanting those cards to play. And what happens is the Central Intelligence Agency uses that to unravel him, because they had no further use. and especially when he was going to bat with people like Helms. And what he does is he doesn't fire Helms outright, but he says, "You're out at the CIA, but I'll make you ambassador to Iran." But so you can see those secrets working their way through. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 128. We're going deep here on the UFO file, COG, and the CIA. 75 years of the National Security Act, 75 years of deception. We're going to be taking more of your questions here. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's crucial. It keeps us in touch through all these waves, intense waves of secrecy that are going on and censorship like you wouldn't believe. But we're going to keep doing it. I've always said, regardless of what they do, I could broadcast on an iPhone if I have to. Not on that iPhone that says, lower your music. That's right. You pay $700 for this thing and it starts giving you these little nanny state reminders, But I do feel it's interesting and important. So make sure you go to darkjournalist.com, because when you get the newsletter, that's just a pipeline in case all the social media stuff blows up, frankly. And basically, there's nothing involved there marketing wise. It's just once a week, you'll get this really incredible update of the things we have coming up for you. I want to tell you right now, the things that are coming up are off the charts for this summer. Interviews, dynamic X series episodes, incredible guests, Gigi Young, incredible things that are happening there. And real big surprises also on the guest front, and even some names you wouldn't expect necessarily. So really, really great. So make sure that you're signed up there. And also, the best way for you to kind of make sure that you're plugged in some way or another, we have a Telegram there, and that's Real Dark Journalist on Telegram, and that's new, fairly new. And some people are getting some interesting information on that. Some people have told us, you should be on Rumble, you should be on these other things and all the rest. That's all well and good. I'm looking at all those platforms. And, I'm going to keep on here on this platform for as long as they'll have me, because I think this is a crucial way for us to get that point across. And, I'm going to do things the way that I've always done them here, delivering you the facts through this particular platform. If the platform changes, that's their prerogative. That's their problem in a way. But for me, I'm just going to keep doing it the way I'm doing it. And we have certainly spread out to some other platforms, and we're developing more things. So that's going to be exciting down the road. And also later this summer, a new website. So you're going to be plugged into all that stuff. Make sure you're on that subscriber list. Miss Olivia.
Okay. Susan Harmony, do you think China has made contact with aliens? And Jordan Banner, is there a connection to China with the UFO op and continuity of government?
A connection with China?
Yeah. What's the deal with China and aliens?
Well, look, this is very important, because you have to know something, which is all of these countries are deeply involved in the UFO file. We have a real edge because of the level of study that's gone on. That's one piece. But the other piece that's crucial is that Russia has always had an advanced program around the UFO file. At a certain point, Andropov orders in the early 80s all military pilots to submit UFO reports directly to him. That's a huge change, and he must have been very aware on the UFO side with this. We have to also remember that one of the things that Kennedy was negotiating, which is on record, is he was negotiating with the Russians so that we would have the ability to exchange UFO file reports. So, and his opinion was this will never set off a nuclear exchange. If a UFO gets too close to a nuclear base, we'll both be able to have that hotline because we've shared information on it. That's what he was after in the last month of his life. The memo's dated November 12th. The full report about sharing the space race, getting rid of the space race and sharing these joint moon missions and cooperation with the Russians in space are right at the Kennedy Library. So they can't be denied. Those memos are there. What are you going to do with that? That's where Kennedy was going with this. He understood in 1963 where we needed to go with the UFO file. not threats, not weaponizing space. He made, a clear line that the exploration of space was for science. It had nothing to do with armaments. So that's crucial. And we have to really remember that and thank him for setting that tone. Where are we doing now? Even Trump, and I understand Trump doing the Space Force because he wanted to pull back that executive authority over the UFO file. It makes sense, actually. But the thing that they tricked him into was calling, and maybe he wanted to be tricked into it, actually, but calling space a warfighting domain. And that is so, and they say, well, China is going to do it. We might as well do it. No, what you do is all nations together say that's a no weapons zone, but they won't until their people on the ground say, we don't want, while we have people starving and inflation at 10% and unemployment and lockdowns, you spending money on armaments and space so Lockheed Martin and Boeing will be happy. It needs to be a change in consciousness here, and we need to reflect that directly to our Congress people. They can't run us around being like, oh, hey, that guy doesn't believe in trans rights, or, give me something real. Okay, here's the real thing. Weaponizing space should be off the table for the human race. Start there, all countries now. Boeing will lose a lot of money. Lockheed will lose a ton of money. That central deep state will lose a ton of money. That's something that we can do. That's the push that we can do. These are the things I think we need to concentrate on. Yes. What do you got?
Karen Carpenter, I really want to ask this. Is there anything DJ wishes he could ask Jim Marrs about current events?
Oh, I had great conversations with Jim for years. And he was so tuned in. He was very hard to fool. And I think that was part of the Texas thing. It's fool me once, shame on you, that whole thing. He would understand the UFO threat thing. Obviously, he wrote the book, Alien Agenda, around 2000, I think. So, he understood what was real about dangers involved with this phenomena, but he definitely understood when we were being manipulated by the CIA. He understood the Kennedy assassination on so many levels. So I think, if anything, this conversation that came up between Judge Napolitano and Trump just before the JFK records were blocked, and Trump saying to Napolitano, I can't let them out. And Napolitano, who was friendly with him at the time, that changed later. But at the time, they were tight friends. And he said, look, I'm like, I can be your legal counsel for this. You promised the world on this, and don't treat the American people like children. And Trump said, Andrew, if you saw what was in those records, you wouldn't let them out either. You couldn't. So something is in there. There's a mechanism, I believe, that the Kennedys left in the CIA records that would implicate them, because otherwise those records, there wouldn't be any reason for them not to let those records out. I've heard at times, hey, look, there isn't going to be any smoking gun on those records. There's no way they're ever going to let the records out. Nonetheless, Trump's response to Napolitano clearly indicates that there's something in the records still that exists that would completely demolish the whole deep state. And somehow it's involved maybe with America's reputation and otherwise. It might be directly related to the UFO file. But there's a real conversation between the president who's seen it, and even though he was going to release it, didn't. So why did that conversation happen? So Mars would be great for that one. Fantastic. Keep going.
Najat Madri, how do we know space isn't a war-fighting space? What's the movie Star Wars really about?
Well, this is the real deal. There has to be some understanding, I think, about this as well, which is something took place, which is part of our memory back there, and a planet was destroyed. And that's where I think Star Wars comes from. You can find it in the mystery schools that a planet was destroyed. If you look at some of the Casey readings, when they ask him, why does this planet wobble? And, why is this strange trajectory and stuff? And he says, if you redo the trajectory and you place a planet between these two planets, right where there's all this debris in the asteroid belt, then you would understand the gravitational pull better. So something happened where a planet was destroyed. There's no question about it. Dr. Farrell, the Cosmic War books, talk about that. And that takes place a long time ago. In the Steiner work, we have forces operational that go far beyond physical bodies in the heavens moving, and that each planet and its spherical representation take on a spiritual character. And this is basically a war in the heavens. So we can't reduce ourselves to just looking at space as space. It represents spiritual initiations. And so you get into, we get into flat trouble when we just think of it as, well, there's a group on the moon, and they were firing at the Earth or something. What's interesting about that, and one thing I wanted to bring up here, let's see if I can do this quickly. By the way, for all of you who are wondering, that is Fred Chrisman, who also referred to himself as John Gold, interestingly enough. A couple of quick things about Chrisman. Chrisman served in the OSS during World War II as a liaison for the British Royal Air Force. He flew several combat missions in Europe and Asia. He flew his last mission May 26, 1945, and allegedly came across in the Maury Cave in Burma. In 1946, Chrisman wrote a letter about the supposed Lemurian cave to Ray Palmer's magazine, Amazing Stories. That's the same Ray Palmer that's going to hire our friend Kenneth Arnold to investigate the Maury Island case. In 47, Chrisman was an active officer with the United States Army Air Force Reserve, working in marine salvage, and was employed by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Additionally, he was an active agent assigned to the Pacific Northwest as a special investigator at large. What's interesting is there's a lot of pieces about Chrisman and his background, but this Lemurian cave thing, he's involved here with ancient civilizations. He's involved with the UFO file. He's involved with the JFK assassination. His partner is someone named Riconosciuto, whose son will be Michael Riconosciuto, who gets involved in developing all of the Octopus software that the United States government will use to spy on their allies. And that whole piece is directly connected to Chrisman. Let's think about that. Chrisman gets charged by Garrison with being a shooter involved in the JFK assassination. He's involved with the UFO file, and his partner's son is the software genius Riconosciuto, who exposes what the government is doing with this backdoor software. He gets thrown into prison as somebody who is creating a meth lab. By the way, he got out recently. He doesn't like to talk on the record, but this guy is definitely remarkable. Yes.
Ratboy Genius, did anyone ask Canada why these mysterious crafts were flying down from the north? Is there any record of them asking whether they invaded Canadian airspace? There were any witnesses there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Canadian UFO program is very advanced. And Wilbur Smith is somebody who put so much of it on the record during 1950 and try to bring it forward. What's interesting about him is he's the person who records the incredible sort of relaying of this information by Robert Sarbarker. And Sarbarker was the physicist who was booted out of history, and you can't even find a Wikipedia page on him. He's a non-person. But Sarbarker shows up in these circles because in the 80s, he gave all this information about the UFO file. But what's interesting is it matched up perfectly with what he told Wilbur Smith in 1950. And in that conversation, he said the UFO file is regarded higher than the atomic bomb program. The other thing, he also talked about crash recoveries, and he talked about the lineage of who had taken over the UFO file, starting with Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush was over here at MIT, and who was his protege? John Trump. So John Trump knew about the UFO file. How much does that extend into Trump's presidency? And when we get into this, does it explain them freaking out so much about Trump beyond oh, he's a dinosaur or whatever. Well, what if he knows about the UFO file and they do, and they don't like a president that has that kind of ability? They prefer Stepford Biden dawdling around. You have to keep these things in mind as we go. Yes.
David Allen, will the U.S. space program face a shortage of kerosene and liquid oxygen and exotic ingredients essential for rocketry development and launch, along with strategic materials with the Ukraine war?
Oh, well, that's really true. There's another fascinating piece there, which is for a long time, we couldn't get off the ground without Russia giving us booster rockets. So something is strange about that. They had also cut NASA's budget previously, which meant the end of the public buying program was out, and that the covert money going out the back door had swelled to such a point that they just didn't need NASA anymore. And I noticed that NASA, in the middle of all this a couple of weeks ago, said, hey, we're going to, start getting into reviewing UFOs too. Hey. Look, NASA's always had a UFO program. And so whenever these people talk like this, it's so ridiculous, because they just mean publicly will say something. It doesn't mean they'll give you the actual truth. And they're not just developing programs anymore. They've always had programs. It's the arc absurd. Here's an interesting thing, though. When I spoke about Sar Barker a moment ago, let me just say again, Sar Barker was a physicist on the level of like Oppenheimer. And he was right up there as respected as somebody like Einstein before they wrote him out. He was on the cover of Saturday Evening Post and everything else. He was the best friend of Thomas Townsend Brown. And they did all kinds of clandestine tours together. And one of the things that they did together was go to San Antonio, Cuba. And that's very close by on the western tip there, where Polina Zalitsky found the Atlantean city right off the coast. So something, again, with T.T. Brown and what they were doing there originally. Somebody mentioned the Caroline Group earlier. This is important because Thomas Townsend Brown, when he goes to Cuba, he is part of an experiment of deep sea submersibles. And they were experimental at the time. Those people wanted to go down and look off the tip of Cuba to see those ruins then. That was 1930. This is around the same time Casey is getting those strange inquiries from those businessmen saying, what if you got on Bimini? And he's saying, well, I have Poseidon temples that are rising, and he's giving them this incredible stuff, and they steal the readings. That's unusual because there's a copy of almost every Casey reading, because they give a copy to the client, they keep a copy. But that whole set, you have the first two readings and then the next two disappear. And I've told this story before, but I think there's a particularly powerful punch to it if we could understand it. That same group that he was giving readings to in relation to the Bimini Wall and those Poseidon temples coming up off the coast of Bimini, they claimed to be New York businessmen, but he couldn't find them afterwards after they ran off with the readings. And he wasn't even sure what it was all about. One of the things that they were absolutely adamant about was taking him to Bimini. So he actually went to Bimini, which is interesting. But what happens in all that is later, Casey goes back in the 30s to give a lecture in New York in 1932. And there are those weird businessmen who got those Bimini readings about Atlantis rising and all the rest, and gold. And he's giving a speech. And he's like, oh, there are those guys. I can finally talk to them and find out what happened. They disappeared, and I thought they were going to go looking for this Atlantean civilization off Bimini. So he gives a speech. He gets off stage. They're gone. They disappeared. They just showed up to listen to him to see, is he going to add anything? That gets you thinking. Yes.
Jordan Banner, does DJ believe that America is the remnant of a specific alien group?
Interesting. It's interesting. Certainly, America is a major zone of activity for UFOs. And I believe they have a major activity here. What's interesting is Massachusetts itself, there's a report from the mayor of Boston at the time. This is around 1690, before the American Revolution or anything. And he's going down the Charles in a boat, and he's like, we saw this thing. It looked like the moon. It came down, it hovered and followed us. He probably was abducted. There he is in 1690 giving this story. So, yeah, I don't know if I could line this up with any particular group. What's interesting is I mentioned the Transcenders earlier, and they said that the one group that the military shot at were the Pleiadians. I find that interesting, considering that just cosmologically, or whatever you want to call it, the Pleiadians are associated with advancing the culture in some way. And so the idea that they would be hostile, and I think the idea being in the Transcenders work anyway, that since we weren't going to get any technology from them, who cares? we'll work with the Greys instead when they'll work with us. One thing I want to mention, since I was talking about Sarbarker and his trips with Thomas Townsend Brown, here's a quickie for you. There were reports that instruments or people operating these machines, this is Sarbarker talking. There were reports that instruments or people operating these machines, the UFOs, were also very lightweight, sufficient to withstand the tremendous deceleration and acceleration associated with their machinery. I remember in talking with some of the people at the office that I got the impression these aliens, quote, were constructed like certain insects we have observed on Earth, wherein because of the low mass and inertial forces involved in operation of these instruments would be quite low. That is really remarkable. That is a physicist talking about his work on the UFO file, on record, one of the top guys from the US program. No wonder he died under suspicious circumstances. He also said John von Neumann, who was deep involved in the Manhattan Project, was definitely involved. Dr. Vannevar Bush was definitely involved. And I think Robert Oppenheimer was also. So they had their top guns in there with this. Of course they did. And this idea that, the deep state has suddenly just discovered UFOs, and shucks, DHS says, we don't know what it is. Yeah, I don't think so. Yes, Ms.
Adam
Olivia.
Cram, DJ, do you think that UFOs are piloted by Atlanteans who have bases under the ocean?
It's interesting. There used to be rumors about Mount Shasta that were like that, which the idea went that the Lemurians were so advanced that a lot of the UFO sightings at Mount Shasta were this culture that decided, you know what, we're going to bail out from the, destruction around us, and we're going to take our technology underground. So I think the idea of, Atlanteans piloting ships now is a little far out. But I always point out that interesting story, going back to a Casey thing again, but they asked him, they said, well, what would the Atlantean ships have looked like, and Casey was kind of like, oh, that's easy. It's the same thing as Ezekiel described, but at a much later date. So somebody had preserved that technology from the time of Atlantis. Okay, Atlantis is 200,000 BC, but goes under around 10,000 BC, to the time of Ezekiel, 4,000 BC. So those 6,000 years in between, somebody kept it, because by the time they show up to Ezekiel and he sees all the wheels within a wheel, that's, according to Casey, the Atlantean technology he's looking at. So that's interesting. There's a lineage of that and how to do it. And that's what I think the Hall of Records stories are about. But it's an interesting question. No question about it. Yes.
Fooper Fighter. Was America the forbidden zone for millennia after Atlantis, i.e. Planet of the Apes?
That's really interesting. I think America was an incredibly well-kept secret somehow. And, but there were active explorations here, so that the whole Columbus story, discovering America, it's a joke. The Templars were here 2 centuries before him. So, and he flew, if you go into a conversation I had with Dr. Farrell on his book, Thrice Great Hermetica, which is fascinating information in there. There's a big section about Columbus and the Templars and the Big X that Columbus makes the signature on when he signs the Pope's casket. At his funeral, he signs this very elaborate steganography, and nobody knows what it is. The Ideas Room has a better idea of it than historians. Here's the interesting thing. He was flying a Templar flag, which should have been completely taboo. So that's his indication to whoever was watching, I'm in league with you as I head to America. I think that they had an operation in America that was like gold mining, and that they wanted to continue to do that, and they didn't want other people to know about it. And there's that fascinating moment when Columbus goes before, the King of Spain and his queen, and he starts talking about what America is like before he goes. And they say to him, hey, that's really interesting. The way you talk about it, it sounds like you've already been there. Because, in fact, he was, everyone. Somebody mentioned Vikings in there. Yeah, there's actually a lot of Casey readings about Eric the Red visiting in 11th and 12th century, somewhere around there, and how he went to Minnesota and things. So certainly the Vikings were here, but the Templars for sure. And then if you go further, the fleeing Atlanteans coming up through Yucatan go where? They go to Ohio. They go to Kentucky. They go to New Mexico. So those leftovers, the mound builder cultures, those are leftovers of those advanced technological Atlanteans. And here's the thing, they depend very heavily on the two-eye stone. Well, the two-eye stone was just shorted out and the whole world is an apotheum. They take off and they have to kind of recreate themselves with, skins and tents and everything else, because it's the same thing that would happen to us if we short-circuited through an EMP right now. We'd have to go back and figure out right from the basics. And how many average people know how things work? Let's think about it. I mean, could an average person create a computer right off the bat? I mean, certain people would have expertise, but average people in general don't, we don't know how to build a lot of the things that we use in society, let's face it. So the Casey story still resonates there powerfully. Yes.
Global Atlantis, are aliens us, or are they visitors from other planets?
Ask Gigi Young. Here's the thing. It depends on who you're talking about. So the overemphasis on the idea that, hey, there's an alien civilization. They came here in a craft that they built nuts and bolts and came the same way that we're building ours. That's an overemphasized story. Obviously, they're on a different vibrational level. So there's a lot of things to be said there. The way that technology operates is very different as well. So you could, there's various things about what aliens could be and what the UFO phenomena could be. One of the things that's suggested is it's us from the future coming back. That's a very interesting possibility, considering how they seem to be almost like a mutated, of the Greys anyway, seem to be some sort of mutated version of us with no hair and things like that. It's almost like us after a huge nuclear thing where we're cloned out through transhumanism and then a nuclear strike. There's that. There's also the idea that off-world civilizations have visited here and that they have a long history with us here that's been blocked out. I think there's a lot to that. And I don't discount it at all because there's so many stories about it. But then here's the real kicker of it all. In the mystery schools, they talk about, in those periods, the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, the groups that were in charge of our evolution here on Earth. Obviously, those are very advanced beings, but they're spiritual physical beings. They're not just spiritual or just physical, because at one point there's there's that incredible quote in the Bible that says the sons of God came down and fell in love with the daughters of men and produced giants, and the giants raged and created a big problem, and that's where the flood came from. So what is that an echo of? Something in the evolution story didn't go right, and the groups that were in charge of our evolution screwed it up. And what happened instead was they fell more into our mentality instead of rising us up to their level. So there's a lot of stories of that, and a lot of the echoes of the Nephilim, etc., in the mystery school work. If you look for it, it's very eye-opening because it talks about these beings, and they are alien in that sense, except that it's, you know, it's not like some alien culture that just popped up on another planet and came over here in a flying saucer. Yes.
Alex Kuhn, DJ, how do you maintain enough optimism to fuel your hard work while dealing with these dark topics on a daily basis?
I'm dark journalist. This one answers itself. No, I appreciate that. Look, I'm fascinated by all the things I report on. I think that's the most important aspect of any work, is to be interested in what you're doing and to feel that you can do it well. So they asked President Kennedy, well, you know, what's your goal in life? And he said, well, it's like the Greeks, right? Exercise your powers along the lines of excellence. You want to really find those things that you're interested in, and really to do it with all of you is fascinating, because I learned so much from you guys in the ideas room and from the people in the field. And when I look around and I see people on the public stage, like Catherine Fitz, RFK Jr., Dr. Farrell, my friend Alexandra Bruce, Gigi Young, you know, I mean, this is the time. This is a perfect time to do it. And I am fundamentally optimistic, although it's pretty obvious to me that the Ahrimanic aspect of what we're facing is, you know, that transhumanist part is absolutely devastating. And so, you know, we'll all get through, but it's a major battle. And interestingly enough, you know, that thing about Fitz saying we're at war, I think it's a good way for us to understand this, because I would say over the course really of the last couple of years, the war is open now. Now it's a kind of open warfare. And I think the way we get through it is awareness and not getting conned into their idea of battle, you know. So
could you talk for
that's
a minute?
One you could answer too.
Actually, could you talk for a minute about how our challenge during these times is to use the war, the battlefield, as a catalyst for growth and for transformation? So turn it into a positive?
There's no question about it. I think you have the right idea. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say it?
Well, I mean, this is my whole goal.
You're absolutely right. There's no question that, you know, what is it in society that is worthwhile, right? For people, it's their children's future. It's the lives that they have being free and inspired and moving forward. And the culture itself it's trying to twist that, you know, it's trying to make children a pawn, you know, to be used by the transhumanist style forces. And that crowd knows what they're doing. They know how to manipulate people against each other. They've been doing it for thousands of years. But now they have this technology, and that's different. So, you know, there's a period in time where you could look back and say, well, in Rome, there was corruption. Or you could say, well, in the Middle Ages, there was all this corruption and all the rest. And there's always corruption to be dealt with. But the corruption mixed with this technology is something we haven't seen since the Atlantean times. And we were totally different on the evolutionary scale then. So this is something we've never seen, although there's an unconscious memory of what this kind of thing is like and what the consequences can be. Because the Atlantean story is very telling because of what Casey tells us about the Belial group. They win, but they win by destroying everything. So the Amelius group can't stop them, but the Amelius group wins in this, that they take away the information and hide it in 3 places. So that story resonates so much with the legacy cultures that we have, that Hall of Records story with the Sphinx and the pyramids. So I think there is something fundamental about humanity and its evolution that inspires a kind of optimism about where we can go. Honestly, things can be incredible and we can learn so much. And the group that is controlling the reality on the ground is so limited and so backward that there's a retarded nature to the thing of where they're going. And so, they're regressive in that sense. But in our day-to-day lives, they exercise a tremendous amount of power. But the fact is that the very undeveloped people, I mean, look at Zuckerberg or Bezos. Not to be judgmental, but just look at them. Do they inspire confidence, or do they just have a lot of money? I don't see anything about them in terms of people that seems to be developed. What's strange is they seem to have almost a freakish, undeveloped quality about them. Like, they missed an essential thing, and that made them perfect for this psychotic leadership that we have. But that whole thing can change. So that would be my take on that. Yes.
Well, and I think ultimately this is all about power, right? We
Yes.
we have to stop looking outside of ourselves and hoping things will turn around. We just have to sort of occupy our corner of the world the best that we can and ask ourselves, what can we do? How can we serve our community? And I'm going to say it although it sounds corny, it's very clear to me. How can we radiate love? How can we be more loving?
Oh, no, that doesn't sound corny.
Yeah. And because that is what the world needs more than anything else. And the more, unfortunately, with social media, we spend so much time railing against the other team, other people. They're at fault. They're the problem. And you know what? Gigi has taught me something, and I'm still processing it. But, you can be alone in a room and meditate and call upon your guides and angels, and they forge that connection and get all the answers. Stop asking. I've asked shamans and teachers for years for answers, and I now understand. They kept trying to redirect me. What do you think? Go inside, find your answers. It's not intellectual. It is through this relationship with your higher self and with your guides, and that is where it all is. That's the richness. And you know what? Bill Gates doesn't matter there. Zuckerberg doesn't matter. Those people are irrelevant. So I'm not going to spend any more time really railing against them.
Yeah,
I'm going to find my own answers by focusing on my heart and developing myself.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's a heart-centered approach that'll make all the difference. There's no question about it. I wanted to add a couple of quick things here. We're going to have two more questions. And I have this thing about the craters of the moon. I didn't get to it. I'm just going to give you a highlight here. I'm going to do a bunch of these anniversary shows because we have the Roswell anniversary, the National Security Act, and all of these different pieces. So tonight was the Kenneth Arnold COG a piece, but let's do this. There's a place, this is connected to the Kenneth Arnold story, and it got me into the Cosmos Club thinking again. Watch this. Craters of the Moon. This is a place in Idaho. Not far, it's kind of between Ketchum, where Ernest Hemingway lived, and where our friend Arnold lived. So Craters of the Moon, a number of weird things happened there. One, it was discovered by our friend, John Wesley Powell, the founder of the Cosmos Club. Remember that he was stationed for 5 years in Cape Girardeau during the Civil War, and Cape Girardeau was the scene of a major UFO sighting in 1941, many years later. It's still strange that he was there, and then creates the Cosmos Club and is fascinated with the stars and the Grand Canyon and everything else. One of the things that I speculated upon in the Cosmos Club episode was that John Wesley Powell actually ran across something like a crashed UFO back then, and that's where so much of this came from, and that would give him the ability to form this society to study that question in a clandestine fashion, because there's something weird, very, very, very strange about the John Wesley Powell story and about the foundation of the Cosmos Club and the secrecy wrapped around it. So Craters of the Moon was one of these discoveries of Powell, and it was this area that was looked like the surface of the moon, basically, except we hadn't been to the moon yet. So it was an interesting name for him to come up with. There's all kinds of volcanic strata there. Now, what's interesting is our friend goes through this whole process around craters of the moon, etc. Then later, when we discover actual craters on the moon, someone else we're familiar with, Dr. Farrell, writes a little bit about it. And he's talking about the lunar transient phenomena that's suggestive of an artificial origin, like domes that were observed on the surface of the moon that they thought were craters on the moon. So other reputable astronomers from all over the world, the American military nerves were already on edge. This is from the Cosmic War book from Dr. Farrell. And so the American military nerves were on edge with endless UFO activity. They were bound to sit up and take notice since 1953, as author Daniel Ross observes, quote, "The National Security Agency had been behind the official censorship of information concerning UFOs, and now it was equally necessary for them to clamp down on security regarding any proof of alien operations on the moon." By 1954, the guidelines and restrictions were set regarding any photographic studies or announcements by the big observatories concerning the moon. Uninhabitable theories, planetary studies of the moon, Mars, Venus, that had the capability of disproving the uninhabitable theories were now a matter of national security. They shut them down. So, they have this whole thing, none of these planets could support life, etc. That's what the scientific thing is. But anyone in 1954 who came forward with photographic studies or announcements about the moon, planetary studies of the moon, Mars, and Venus that had the capability of disproving the uninhabitable theories were now a matter of national security. You get shut down. If you say, hey, there's a structure up there, we've seen it, we're scientists, we're looking at it, we're astronomers independent, and we think that it represents a form of habitable life that was there at one point. And what they were talking about was this lunar transient phenomena suggestive of an artificial origin, like the domes that were observed and cataloged. And again, thinking about John Wesley Powell and his very unusual craters of the moon. So I went into craters of the moon a little bit, and they dubbed it this whole place where nobody could occupy it. It's one of those nature preserves, and that's great and all that. But then, interestingly enough, who shows up in the middle of that? Now, it's in 1924, they say it's all scientific land, it's a nature preserve. But in 1994, President Clinton comes out and says, we need to really protect it and expand that whole area. So something about this piece in Idaho, and right above it, when you're looking up on the map there, you've got Ketchum, where Hemingway was, and I'm thinking about this as we go. And then Powell, again, showing up in the middle of this. So now we have Dr. Farrell looking at the actual moon craters and saying, part of the problem with these scientists looking at the moon is that now they're under national security orders. Don't talk about the idea that anyone else was ever on the moon. Here's another one. This is Dr. Farrell's sort of takeaway on this. And so the moon, if it was captured, would have to, let me see if this is the right quote. Oh yeah, if the moon was captured, it would have to accelerate as it entered the gravitational pull of the Earth. I recommend the whole book for the quote, but I'm just going to give you a snapshot to tantalize with this moon piece. And we will do something a little more full on this. This in turn would inevitably have led to an elongated and elliptical orbit, but this is not what the millennia of observations have shown. Since the moon is apparently older than the Earth, it stands to reason that the capture model is correct in its basic outline. However, no known mechanism can account for its current orbital mechanics. In short, it would appear that the moon had to have been braked, B-R-A-K-E-D, as it entered Earth's orbit in such a fashion as to assume its current position. As no known naturalist mechanism exists to explain such braking, the only other explanation would appear that it would have been intelligently guided to its current position. It is a celestial mechanics analog to parallel parking a car. So the shutdown there and the synchronicity of the whole moon surface thing is something. It's just a preview for an upcoming episode, but I wanted to make sure we got that in. And of course, I recommend that Cosmos Club episode is kind of a prelude to that. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's from last year. And with that, Miss Olivia, the last question of the night.
I'm just going to give it to Scarlet Fire. It's not a question, but it's a comment. Be reminded, everybody, that our intention comes from our hearts, and our hearts are thousands of times stronger field generators than our brains alone.
Wow, that's really true. Well, coming from a heart place, that is absolutely crucial. Here, that's a shot from Salem, Massachusetts in 1952. Those crafts, you can almost, if you really tune into that stuff, like those are craft on a mission. That's the kind of stuff I think that Arnold was dealing with. And they were on a mission here in that period of time. This is a shot of LBJ with Vannevar Bush. There he is meeting now. He'd already been the advisor for FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, JFK. There he is with LBJ, and eventually he'll serve our friend Richard Nixon as well. Vannevar Bush, with his knowledge and control of the UFO file, absolutely crucial figure. And remember his protege, good old John Trump. A couple of quick things fly by at the end here. Of course, that is our friend James Forrestal. I'm going to reveal to you here something interesting, which is going to come up in a future episode. But I now have established proof of Ernest Hemingway meeting with James Forrestal, which has not been on record before. This is going to be kind of powerful. The connection that they have, and again, it's going to open up this question of the UFO file and the hot zone. Big piece there coming forward, coming at you nonstop. And before we check out on this one, this is just so we understand that whole thing about the X designation. Okay, August 14th, 1947, the FBI, Seattle. This is the document that was sent by the gentleman we referred to earlier, Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister set up the UFO X designation. Flying disc sighted by Fred Crispin and Harold Dahl, Tacoma, Washington, SMX. Please be advised that Dahl did not admit to Smith that his story was a hoax, but only stated that if questioned by authorities, he was going to say it was a hoax because he did not want any further trouble over the matter. Complete report now en route to the Bureau, which indicates probably Crispin or Dahl made the anonymous phone call in the hope of building up their story through publicity. What's interesting about this is that designation, the SMX, they were using it now right at the beginning of the UFO wave. Security Matter X, that's the X technology, the X classification. That's where you get that secrecy moving through the government divisions using the steganography of X. And it survives this day through things like SpaceX and the X steganography that we're seeing emerging in society all over the place. A shot of JFK with de Gaulle. One of the classic quotes, since we were talking about Kennedy earlier, is when he's talking with de Gaulle, and de Gaulle says, did the CIA participate in the attempt? Of course they did, to remove de Gaulle with the, there was a French coup that was planned. And JFK said, I no longer have control over the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm trying to get that control back. So he's basically apologizing to a French official saying that our Central Intelligence Agency tried to remove you. So therefore, Kennedy is working during his presidency. We have to see his presidency as an attempt by the executive branch to get the power back for the people in the United States over this covert structure, which hid the UFO file, created the National Security Act, and the secret system of finance. This is the thing that we're living under, because that group, the Kennedy group, they did some remarkable things like saving us from nuclear holocausts and all the rest. But this other group, the covert group, was able to take them out. And one way or another, I mean, they've had ups and downs. with how they've survived, but they certainly have survived, and we're looking very much at, right down the barrel of the same forces some 60 years later. And there's no question about it. The thing is, exposing that story and bringing it out there to people is crucial. And the space part, which has been left off the table, and you can't discuss the Kennedy assassination without the space part. To me, it's absurd. The best researchers, when they get around it and they're talking about it, all I can think to myself is, it's right there. It's right on the edge of what you're talking about. Now, what's interesting, of course, is there's a COG aspect to the Kennedy assassination, which is through one of the Secret Service agents who sets up the route and then uses the Doomsday Network, the emergency communications network, while he's on the route. They hadn't done that before. And so the White House emergency communications was activated and worked before the assassination, which means the COG network is operational. So I've pointed this out before, but so you have there in the middle of the JFK assassination through Watergate and through all these deep events, the COG people, that comes directly out of the work of Professor Scott. And that, I think, is a great jumping off place and maybe the best way for us to wrap this episode. And Kenneth Arnold, of course, gave us that really hardcore understanding in the beginning. And in his own book, he lays out the entire story. And as I say, it's basically not only a cosmic mystery, but a murder mystery. And on the spot, the Men in Black, X-Protect, and the Deep State is there already, right at the very beginning of this. The last moon mission, manned mission to the moon, took place in 1972, coming up here in the fall. And that is another 50-year anniversary. You got Watergate 50 years and the last moon mission. There's been nothing in between. There's no other manned missions into the moon or any other planets. That's the secret space program. They've been working on that, and that's where the whole missing money aspect with the secret space program goes. Those are the key factors. Those are the things that are going to help us get there. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to leave you to it. I'll do some shout outs, but first.
Okay. All right. We've got lots of super chatters to thank.
Yes.
So Bobo the Clown, Shiny Gee, Cult Fan, Gillenjoy R, Izzy the Great, Stephen, Dorian Hewitt, Rosterman the Seer, Bob Binder, Norman Smith, Housatonic Live, Jim Sarge 3ID, and Gummy Bears, Eurythmia's Fun, Mark Lane, Tricky Vicky, PD, C Goody, Sandra Lavender, Global Atlantis, Joe Sampson, Esoteric Fairy Tales, Jay Liebgott, Karen Carpenter, Wayne Peak, and Doyle Wayne. Thank you so much for your generosity.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate your support for the show and for the work that we're doing here to bring you these reports. We'll be back at you next Friday with an incredible X Series 129 rolling into that July 4th. And we know that's going to be something as well. We may have some very interesting update reports between now and then. So stay tuned and make sure you sign up for that newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that newsletter. And I also want to say to our subscribers, thank you for all the incredible efforts on our behalf and keeping us going during this period of time. That UFO file now coming into view, it seems like the world is catching up to the research. And now we can really get the conversation on a higher level. And that's where we have it in the ideas room. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs here. Let's see what I have. Dash Render. Great show. Thank you so much for the awesome work. DJ and Olivia, thank you. I really appreciate you guys being out there. Ray Story, great show, Daniel. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Berglot 100. Excellent. Thank you for being here. Bo Krills, David Allen, Pono, SOS, a little bit of everybody. Great crowd here tonight in the Ideas Room. Someone says, can I get a shout out? I can't read the names.
Lavish.
Lavish, of course. There you go. A 4-hour show. Amazing stuff. Did we go that long? Holy mackerel. 3 hours and 18 minutes. Not bad. Daniel for president. That's good. Can you just imagine what they would do with me?
On that note, Eric the Dude said, I'm curious what DJ has dug up about Senator Mike Gallagher. He was one of my best friends growing up. I have no doubt he'll be president soon if the Union survives.
Oh, wow. Well, Gallagher was doing all of the hijinks, and it's interesting that he was a good friend of yours. If you could write me at admin@darkjournalist.com, I'd like to hear more about that. And but he was the guy who was coming out and saying, UFOs are really from the future, and he was doing all this wild stuff. And I was thinking, God, I don't know if this guy knows he's being used, but he was really being kind of the, I mean, he really was getting the message out, and he was talking about all this weird stuff. He's the guy who brought up the Wilson documents, which, by the way, I don't think hold any water, but he brought them up, and nobody knew what they were, and he was like, let's read them into the record. But, I don't know. He was definitely up to something. We love you, DJ. Thank you, C. Ray. Jay Mallet. Thank you, Daniel and Olivia. You put the awe in awesomeness. It's pretty good. Fantastic. Great show tonight. Thank you very much. Excellent. Scarlet Fire. Don't become that which offends you. I like that a lot.
Exactly.
I know we had Gigi out there tonight. Kate. Fantastic. Silver Fox, Esoteric Fairy Tales. When is the astrology episode? It's coming. Don't fear the Reaper. Where's that? Never show fear, DJ. Yeah, I think that's right. What else you got over there?
I was thinking actually about Ben-Hur. It is that you have become masala, right? That's
yes.
Thing. That is the trick. It's all of us. If we stay in a place of conflict, of fighting, even with an enemy who deserves, our wrath, it changes us.
That's really true.
And we don't want to become that. We want to be elevated. We want to be transcended. We want to be transformed into better versions of ourselves. So we have to be very, very cautious. What are we here for if not to improve ourselves?
Gigi promised to do something on bees. I'm sure she will. Golden Girl, thank you. Melanie K, DJ, if they come and offer you a ride in the disc, will you go? It depends on what kind of disc we're talking about here. If it's Defense Industrial Security Command, probably not. But the other guys, maybe. Bosley is hiding. Nick Malone, you're going to have to explain that.
Bosley's in the chat.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, that's great. It's great to see you out there, sir. We need to have a party. Joan Q. Public. Boy, is that true. Modwiz. Holy. Present for show, but quiet. It's good to see you, sir. What else we got? Wally Tango Foxtrot. The predator parasites feed on the negative energy of fear and hate. Oh, that's really good, actually. That says a lot. That's 90% of news reports right there. Be the warrior gardener. I like that. Yeah, I don't garden, but I like the idea. You can garden in different ways, I guess. Dark Journalist Meetup. Yes, hell yes. I missed you again. Well, it's right here for you to replay through the magic of YouTube Memorex.
Dash Vendor. The wolf you feed is the wolf who wins. Right on. Excellent.
Any energy I receive, I return tenfold. Nicely done. Everybody, just a great night with everyone. One of the books around this I'd recommend is Ken Thomas's JFK and UFO. Military Industrial Conspiracy to Cover Up from Maury Island to Dallas. Nicely done. And Ken's done some good stuff over the years. And he always did interesting work on Chrisman that I thought was sort of, not pilfered. It was another word for it. But it showed up in other people's work like Lavenda, and I didn't feel it was properly credited. So there you go. Let's see what else we got here. Carl Jung, Moondragon, thank you. Excellent show. Much appreciated. It's great to see everyone. We will see you all next week, maybe with some exciting shows in between. Make sure you sign up for that newsletter if you're not already on. And thank you, DJ and Olivia. I think the Cosmos Club is huge. Yes, I agree with you. And John Wesley Powell, let me tell you, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Indeed. Mr. Wolf, it's great to see you. Olivia Wiggs girl, how did you do that? Amazing. We'll see you all next week. And thanks so much for being here. And it says end broadcast. After all, it never really ends. Am I right?
God bless everybody. Stay in peace in your hearts.
Bye-bye. We love you.